Good evening and welcome to the May 13th, 2014 Downers Grove Village Council meeting. We'd like to begin our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd all rise and join in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. April, could you call the roll, please?
Yes. Commissioner Jose?
Here.
Commissioner Olson?
Here.
Commissioner Rankin?
Here.
Commissioner Barnett?
Here.
Commissioner Neustadt?
Here.
Commissioner Durkin?
Here.
Mayor Tully?
As you can tell, Mayor Tully is not here. We are experiencing some railroad difficulties this evening, so we're going to get a start on our meeting tonight. For those of you live and in the audience with us tonight, we have information packets and agendas on either side of the room. You can pick up and follow along with those. The next thing on our agenda is the review of the minutes for council meetings. Council meeting of May 6, 2014. Any additions or corrections to those minutes as presented? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve?
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Minutes pass. We are now quickly on to item number 4, public comments. Item number 4, public comment, is for general comments of matters not appearing on tonight's agenda. So if you have a comment that is not pertaining to any of the items on our agenda, please come forward to the podium, give us your name and address, and it's your chance to address your elected officials. Long pause and nobody's coming up, so we'll move right along to number 5, council member reports. Commissioner Barnett, any council member report tonight?
Just one announcement. This Friday, the 16th, is the beginning of the Summer Nights Classic Car Show in downtown Downers Grove. Those Mustang fans that are out there, this week happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Mustang, at least in terms of our car show. And keep in mind that it's not only a good time, but there's entertainment, and it's a great way to enjoy your downtown. Just take a stroll with the family, enjoy the local bands that are out, and see some pretty cool cars. So that begins this Friday, May 16th, and continues through the bulk of the summer until, I think it's the end of August. So hope to see everybody out at least sometime through the summer.
Thank you. Commissioner Olson?
Yeah, I did have 2 announcements. It's back into the spring and summertime, so we have 5Ks in our community. So I am excited. We actually have 2 great 5Ks this weekend, both in Downers Grove and both for great causes. On Saturday at 7:30 over at McCullum Park, there's the 3rd annual Run for Rwanda 5K, raising money to support the construction of a church in Rwanda. And on Sunday, May 19th, at 8:30 a.m., there is the Noah's Hope Run for Hope 5K, which is an annual event benefiting Noah's Hope Fund, which is searching and raising money for a cure for Baden's disease. So both are great events. They're a lot of fun to participate in, and also are raising money for great causes in our community. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Jose?
Thank you. The Downers Grove Junior Women's Club is having its 4th annual charity golf scramble this Saturday, May the 17th, starting at 2 o'clock over at the Downers Grove Golf Club. Tickets are $75 a person. That includes dinner. Dinner starts with a cocktail hour at 5 and then is served at 6. If you're not interested in golfing, you actually can buy a dinner-only ticket for $25 a person. There will be a silent auction, raffles, and a live band. So if you would like additional information, you can visit their website, which I had a second ago, and I don't any longer. I apologize. I do have an email here. I apologize. Mia Churma is the contact person. You can reach her at mianoellemc@yahoo.com. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Rankin?
I know it seems like a far way away, but you can register to participate in the July 4th parade for the Village of Downers Grove. The Community Events Commission is looking for more people to participate, community groups, get your block party together, if your business is in town and you'd like to participate, the more the merrier. So you can find the application online at downers.us for more information.
Thank you. Commissioner Durkin?
Yes, thank you. Just if we could get a brief explanation, possibly from staff, in why we are going to be adjourning the council chambers to go into the committee room to discuss the Ogden Avenue sidewalk. I would greatly appreciate that. I did receive several text messages in the last hour asking why. So I figure this would be a good time during the meeting, since we do have everybody's attention that are watching, on why we're going to be adjourning.
Sure. At the request of the council, we've created a more intimate environment for council discussion, a table where council members can face each other, have an informal discussion about key policy issues. We've used it on several occasions. We'll use it again tonight. We have made an enhancement to the coverage of that, if you will. We now have a camera in the committee room that will broadcast live to Channel 6 and stream live to the website as well. So that's the same amount of public access through electronic media as this meeting room offers.
I appreciate that. Thank you, and that's all I have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Barnett, you have something else for us tonight?
I just had one, Jeff. As a kind of alumni, sort of, if you will, spouse alumni, I thought I'd bail out Commissioner Jose. DGJWC, Downers Grove Junior Women's Club.org. That really is an awesome organization in town, and so take a gander at their website and see if you can golf this weekend.
I appreciate that. I didn't want to make everybody wait while I was Googling. I didn't want to have to start whistling or something to fill the time.
I think every Saturday from now until the close of the golf season, there's a worthwhile golf outing at Downers Grove National, so just head over there and join in. So, for my part, I have one quick item. I think we'll leave the proclamations for Mayor Tully when he gets here under the mayor's report. This Thursday, May 15th at 1 p.m., Patriots Park at 55th Street and Grand Avenue, the Downers Grove Police Department will hold a memorial service for Officer Richard J. Barth. This is the 40th year in which Officer Barth was killed in the line of duty in Downers Grove. Each year, our Downers Grove Police Department spends a day during Law Enforcement Week to remember not only our fallen officer here in town, Officer Barth, but all the police officers across the country who have paid the ultimate sacrifice. It's a very moving and important ceremony. It honors not only our Officer Barth, his family attends at the pond and at the park, but it also honors all the other officers that have sacrificed their lives to protect and serve us across the country. So again, Thursday, May 15th, that's this Thursday at 1 p.m., Patriots Park, Barth Pond at 55th Street and Grand Avenue. We do have a contingency plan if there is poor weather. So if there is poor weather on Thursday, take a look at our website, Facebook page, or Twitter feed, and you will see the contingencies that are available. I hope we can see some residents and maybe even some students from the local schools out there again this year. That's all I have for council member reports. We are now on to item number 6, a public hearing, and we do have a public hearing tonight. Forgive me as I read from our public hearing process. This public hearing will come to order. This public hearing has been called by the Village Council to consider a proposed annexation agreement for the property located at 5850 Janes Avenue. Notice of this hearing was published in the Downers Grove Suburban Life on April 23, 2014. I'd like to summarize the procedures which we will follow for tonight's public hearing. First, I will ask the manager to summarize the annexation agreement and identify the property involved. Then the Village Council will thereafter have the opportunity to ask questions or make comments. Members of the public will then be offered an opportunity to ask a question or make a comment regarding this petition. Statements may be presented for the record, either written or oral, and any petitions or other documents or information relevant to this public hearing may be submitted at this time. Thereafter, we will adjourn the hearing. At this hearing, witnesses will not be sworn, and a verbatim written transcript of the statements or testimony given at the hearing will not be prepared. However, the recording of the proceedings will be made on village equipment and retained until minutes of the hearing have been prepared and approved by the Village Council. The proposed agreement will be placed on public file if authorized by the Village Council. Approval scheduled for a future agenda. And now we are ready for the staff summary.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I just want to point out that as Tom Dabriner, our Community Development Director, introduces this item, his introduction and any conversation that follows from the council or the community will also serve as the discussion for item 9A, first reading, final plat of subdivision for the same property. So to expedite the meeting and to have a more coherent discussion, we'll handle both of those at the same time.
I don't know if it was wise to promise a coherent discussion. We'll see if we can make this work tonight. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. A couple things. We have an ordinance that's been prepared for a voluntary annexation agreement for 5850 Janes Avenue. That is the purpose of the public hearing. We're looking for approval next week on May 20th on the active agenda for the ordinance. We also have a resolution, as Mr. Fieldman was saying, that covers the first reading item, resolution for a final plat of subdivision that has been prepared for the same address for 5 new lots in unincorporated Downers Grove, and that's a little bit unusual for us to cover, so we'll spend not a lot of time, but a little bit more than we might otherwise if it was a simpler subdivision. Here is the approximate location that we're talking about, and we'll zoom in a couple times here. That's the property there. It's about 2 acres in that square area. This map actually has a lot of things on it that I want to call your attention to because they all come into play at one point or another. We've got 59th Street running roughly east-west here, and Janes. They do not connect at the moment. The proposal is to have them connect, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. The blue dotted line is the location of the boundary agreement, the boundary line between Downers Grove and Woodridge. That's important because you'll see that a good portion of 59th, the existing portion of 59th all the way up to the property is in the village of Woodridge. The rest of the road network there is in Lyle Township. And the village of Downers Grove, as shown on this map, is just this area here. That's the closest portion, Woodridge and Lyle Township up in these general areas. So it's important, I think, just to kind of understand where we are and some of the issues. The proximity of Downers Grove, in fact, comes into play, and I'll mention that as well. Here's an aerial of the site. Again, kind of a square around the property, heavily wooded. At this point, there are a couple of structures on it. An old house. That old house does receive Village of Downers Grove water today. So this is simply expanding Village of Downers Grove water service to what would be 5 properties in the future. And that's why we need the annexation agreement now. These are the 5 properties as they've been laid out. It includes easement areas and I guess imaginary houses at this point, as shown on the property. This relates to the plat, to the final plat of subdivision that is the other item for first reading tonight. This also includes construction of a 5-foot sidewalk along the south side of the property, the length of the property. Fee paid in lieu for parkway trees, fee paid in lieu for sidewalk on the east side running north-south along Janes. And then it includes the proposed intersection, just these portions here, along with construction or installation of a barrier where that yellow line is approximately. So I've got a couple of slides with the key points because all of this plays into really both issues. First of all, to make sure everyone understands why we're here and talking about this, this property is unincorporated, so typically we're not talking about this kind of thing, but it is within the village's ultimate boundary, and ultimately we will annex this area. It is the village's to annex. And that is based on the boundary agreement, the intergovernmental agreement between the Village of Downers Grove and Woodridge. And that granted Downers Grove annexation authority ultimately, and then we also have subdivision authority as well. Now the subdivision also is granted to us, subdivision rights are granted to us through the state law because the village is within 1.5 miles of, because the site is within 1.5 miles of incorporated Downers Grove. So we also have a right there. And I know that there have been a couple of questions, why are we considering this? That's why. It's a responsibility, and in fact, ultimately, this is a set of properties that comes into the village. The existing 59th Street right-of-way, as I pointed out on the map, and the road is in Woodridge. Lyle Township maintains Janes Avenue and the other portion of 59th Street and any connection that might be made in the future. Any building, street, stormwater permits regarding the project that's upcoming on this property would be reviewed and issued by DuPage County. We don't really have a role in that, a direct role in that. Some additional key points. The existing home, as I mentioned, is connected to village water already. The developer wishes to connect all 5 future homes to the Village of Downers Grove water. There is water lines running along the east side of Janes and the south side of this property. Existing, and it's the water connection because that requires this pre-annexation agreement or annexation agreement as it's listed. The existing home and structures will be demolished. 5 new lots would be carved out. As proposed, they all meet lot dimension requirements. They're consistent with our code requirements for subdivisions. The street is proposed to connect with that barrier. 59th Street would be proposed to connect with that barrier. That's something that's consistent with our comprehensive plan, as well as the overall subdivision plan itself with housing stock diversity and traffic circulation issues, including better emergency access, we believe, in the future with the connection, the full intersection at Janes and 59. So again, the annexation agreement is part of the public hearing process. Certainly our village attorney can fill in any blanks there. And then the final plat of subdivision items, which we've run through on other kinds of properties as well. We've kind of covered those too. So,
Just a couple other points. The annexation agreement has a couple of key terms that would allow the water connection. It states that the properties will automatically be annexed to the Village of Downers Grove if they become contiguous to our village limits. And it also requires these owners and successor owners to participate in any type of annexation initiative that we may undertake in the future. It's important to understand that we are not allowed to annex the property under current Illinois law. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Fieldman. Thank you, Mr. Dave Brenner. Appreciate the presentation. At this point, I will ask if there are any questions or comments from members of the Village Council with respect to the subject of the public hearing. Questions or comments from members of the Village Council? Hearing none, I'll then open it up for any questions or comments from any members of the public who are present here tonight. If there are any questions or comments with respect to the subject matter of this public hearing, which pertains to 5850 Janes Avenue, please come down to the podium. The protocol is to please give us your name and address, and we would welcome hearing from you. Good evening.
I'm Charles Scouten. I'm from 5939 Janes Avenue. It doesn't show us so well on the map. Janes is a very narrow street. It fits the classification of an estate neighborhood. It's zoned small for whatever reason, but all the houses, or almost all the houses, are built on 2 lots. So it's large lots, really. And in estate neighborhoods, you're supposed to protect the character of the neighborhood. And okay. The safety of the children on the street is a huge issue here. The road is very narrow. Children from around the community, from 59th and from Janes and from the other direction, meet the school bus at the end of Janes and College. So there, at all times of days, there's kids walking down the street or back the other way. On weekends, they play on the street. They can't go to the ditches. There's no sidewalks. It's a very narrow street. It's full of kids. The people in the neighborhood know, but if there were pass-through traffic that was trying to avoid Maple and get somewhere in a hurry, this is a recipe for disaster. I have petitions here signed by Every single resident of that strip of Janes, that 2-block strip of Janes, everybody on 59th over to Leonard, and everybody on that block of Leonard. 100% participation, and plus some people from College and Chase who called me and asked if they could sign it too. They heard about it. Nobody wants this to happen. The proposed road, they say they're going to build the road and they're going to put a barrier on it. Well, on the face of it, that's lunacy. You build a road, block it, it's a road to nowhere. No one can drive on it, and it's a trap for people coming down. It narrows, and you got to do a fancy K-turn to get your way out of there once you get trapped in there. So nobody believes that that barrier is permanent. That barrier is going to open up, traffic's going to come out onto Janes. When it does, if it turns right, it hits a cul-de-sac dead end. If it goes straight ahead, it hits a cul-de-sac dead end. The only possible movement coming through from Woodridge on 59th into Janes is to go to College. And it's all the way down the block. It's a long way all the way down the block, and it's a street full of kids of all ages on the way to meet the school bus or playing. This shouldn't happen. I don't know what's going to be necessary to make it stop, but the community is united, willing to take up a collection, whatever it takes. The road from the proposed development can be built. Get city water. None of those houses butt onto the section of proposed road. There's a strip of road there about a third of the way through. The 2 houses empty onto that. And then the other house is empty onto Janes. So it isn't a matter of getting a way in and out for those houses. You can go ahead and do the whole development, build those houses. Just leave 59th Street alone, or put a cul-de-sac there if you have to spend some money. There's no value in putting that road through at 59th. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Thank you for coming down here tonight. And if you haven't already done so, sir, if you want to submit the petitions.
Now? Yes.
Sure. Actually, the gentleman at the end of the table there, Mr. Baker, would be happy to take them from you. He's standing right in front of you.
I haven't made copies of them yet.
Sir, that's fine. If you don't have copies of them, then you can submit them at a later point in time.
Bring them in
We
tomorrow?
want to
Bring
take
them
your
down to
originals.
Village Hall tomorrow?
That'd be perfectly fine.
What office do I turn them in at?
Mr. Baker would be happy to fill you in with more precise information. We'll make sure that you get them to the right person. Thank you. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. My name is Gennady, G-E-N-N-A-D-I-Y. Last name is Lukhanin, L-U-K-H-A-N-I-N. I live right across this green box in this house. I bought this piece of land to build a house for my family because I believe that this is a quiet neighborhood where my kids can come outside and play. And I have a driveway that slopes to Janes Avenue, and they're frequently playing hoops and soccer in that area, and it's a very quiet neighborhood. Right now, what we're discussing, can you rewind this up or down to show that connection? Can you rewind the slides? I don't know, okay. So I'm opposing to opening this patch of grass on Route 59 simply because the Janes Avenue Road is quite narrow, and I can barely pass in my SUV another car during winter month or when it's slippery and wet. And at the same time, we should allow kids who walk from that College Road down to 59th to their residences. So it looks like this is truly a recipe for disaster to happen, simply because there is not enough room to path to allow 2 cars and kids on this road. There is no sidewalk whatsoever. There are ditches on either side of the road. So in my mind, if we open this patch of grass, as Charles has mentioned correctly, what's going to happen, one out of the two? Somebody will come down, hit this cul-de-sac, turn around, and go up. So then, on this side, there's a cul-de-sac too. So the car can come in here and get trapped. So what will happen, it will confuse the traffic pattern, I believe, if you open this road, because, number one, then what I see is here, what we can do here is put it a cul-de-sac, as the builder initially proposed, or we can just leave that patch of grass the way it is. That will preserve the current neighborhood, its state, make it very friendly to our kids, and make it safer. I do not believe that opening this patch of road will be beneficial for the emergency vehicles, because the emergency vehicles are somewhere here, so they have to go around and come in. So I don't see how they would connect with this path. I've looked at the traffic pattern, and I can state that we would see a substantial increase, roughly 50% of what's currently we see on the neighboring streets as far as the traffic. And that could present a potential challenge for kids during the winter days, during the rainy days. And there is nothing worries me more than the safety of my kids and my neighbors' kids. So I would like to keep this patch closed or make a cul-de-sac. But putting a barrier that can be removed a few days after, it's a lunacy. I agree with Charles. So unfortunately, there was some scheduling with our neighbors. They didn't come to this meeting. There was some email communication issue. But they all support the idea of keeping that road closed. And we have a strong, valid point, because we want to preserve the quietness and this, the current state of the neighborhood. We don't want any cut-through traffic in this area. Nobody wants it, except, I don't know who does. Maybe you guys want it. But the question is, ask yourself, why do we want that road to be open? What do we gain? So what do you gain by opening that? If there is no gain, then probably keep it closed. It's the safest bet. Over. Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for your comments. Other questions or comments from members of the audience with respect to this matter? Good evening.
Hi. My name is Deborah Scouton, and I'm at 5939 Janes Avenue in Downers Grove. And first of all, what I would like to say is that if our neighbors knew about this meeting, every single one of these seats would be filled, and we would be here for a much, much longer time. I would ask the panel and the board to think about what we're saying here and give our neighbors a chance to actually voice their concerns. So I am asking to pend your decision tonight so you can hear the rest. There are people who are on Eleanor who are opposed. I wouldn't say opposed, but they're very, very concerned about their water issues, and they would be here too to discuss what's going to happen. But as I'm moving along here, I actually have some questions. I'd like to know if anybody on the panel has visited the area.
At some point, yes.
Has anybody talked to any of our residents or saw the street where at 3 o'clock when the kids are coming down the street? Has anybody seen that? And if you haven't, I'm not really sure that you guys can really make a very good decision. You're looking at a picture here. We're trying to discuss how this is going to affect our neighborhood and affect the children and the safety issues. But unless you come out, talk to us, and see at 3 o'clock what is happening on our street, I'm not really sure that you guys can make a great, inappropriate decision. So my next question would be, why do you want to annex 5 houses? What would be the reason to annex 5 houses? The reason would be to put a road in at 59th Street. That's the only conclusion that I can come up with. And if you're going to do that, then are you going to be putting sidewalks on James Avenue to keep those children safe? That's other question to ponder. So really, that's all I have to say. I just really wish that you would think about pending your decision until you can hear or talk to the rest of our neighbors tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate your comments. And one of the reasons why we have the public hearings is because they're required, but the other reason we have the public hearings is to actually hear from the public. So this is our opportunity to hear some of the views, and we appreciate people coming down and sharing them with us. I'll get to this later, but the procedures are the next step is after the public hearing. When would this next, or when would the soonest time that this would appear on our agenda for an actual vote?
Next week.
No, the earliest we would be doing anything would be next week. Just so that everyone knows that. I'll repeat that later so everyone knows. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Charles Clark, Lisle Township Highway Commissioner, and did have discussion with Downers Grove as far as on 59th Street. And at first, the barrier seemed like a good idea. Upon further review, the Lisle Township Highway Commissioner and Lisle Township prefers at this time that a cul-de-sac be put on 59th Street. I'm not prepared to just answer any questions other than that. So thank you for your letting me speak. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate you communicating that official news to us. Thank you. Any other questions or comments from members of the audience on this topic? And again, obviously, outside of the public hearing process, there are many opportunities to provide information, input, and commentary to the village council. Our website has numerous different vehicles by which to do that. Like I said, this is just one of the many ways we receive input. But if there's anyone here tonight that would like to ask a question or make a comment on this subject? Hearing none, then I will declare the public hearing adjourned for now. And again, as mentioned, the earliest that this would be before us for action would be next week, and that is currently the schedule. So there'll be another meeting next week on this topic, and that would be the earliest point at which any action could be taken. I just want to thank everyone for coming out and sharing their views and comments with us. Very quickly, I just want to apologize to everyone for being a little bit late to tonight's meeting, as some of those of you who watch the council meeting regularly knew exactly where I was, which was stuck on the train. Thanks to Metro once again for making sure that I arrived on time. Well, my apologies, and thanks to Mayor Pro Tem Neustadt for getting things rolling at the scheduled time. One thing about television, we have to start on time. Doesn't matter where you're at. We have no other public hearings tonight, so that will bring us to item 7 on our agenda, which is the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
Second.
Are there any questions or comments from any members of the audience with respect to any of the items on the consent agenda? Hearing none, any questions or comments from members of the village council with respect to any of the items on the consent agenda? Hearing none, may I have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Neustadt?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, consent agenda passes unanimously. That brings us to item 8, which is our active agenda, and we have many items on our active agenda tonight. First, item 8A, do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance amending the liquor control ordinance concerning charitable games?
So moved. Second.
Any questions or comments from any members of the audience with respect to that item? Questions or comments from the village council? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Commissioner Neustadt?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, that matter passes unanimously. It brings us to item 8B as in boy. Do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance to rezone property located at 4837 Drendel Road from R1 single-family residence to R4 single-family residence?
Mayor Tully, I move to adopt an ordinance amending the comprehensive zoning ordinance of the Village of Downers Grove, codified as Chapter 28 of the Downers Grove Municipal Code, as amended to rezone property located at 4837 Drendel Road as presented.
Second.
Any questions or comments from members of the audience? Questions or comments from the village council? members? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye. That matter passes unanimously. Brings us item 8C as in Charlie. Do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance rezoning property located at 4325 Fairview Avenue from R5, two-family residential, to B3, general services and highway business?
So moved.
I heard that in stereo. Do we have a second?
Second.
How's that? Terrific. Questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments from members of the village council? Roll call, please.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye. That matter also passes unanimously. Brings us item 8D as in David. Do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance rezoning property located at 4322 Florence Avenue from R6, multiple family residential, to B3, general services and highway business?
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments from members of the village council? Roll call, please.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye. Matter passes unanimously. It brings us to item 8E as in Edward. Do I have a motion to adopt a resolution authorizing a final plat of subdivision for 317 through 327 Ogden Avenue, 4314 through 4322 Florence Avenue, and 4325 Fairview Avenue?
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments from members of the audience? Questions or comments from members of the village council? May I have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye. That matter passed unanimously. Brings us to item 8F as in Frank. Do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance designating planned development number 52 and authorizing construction of a grocery store and 4,500 square foot outlot building?
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments from members of the village council? I'll just add that, we're looking forward to the project. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, that matter passes unanimously. That brings us to item 8G as in Gus. Do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance authorizing a special use to permit a drive-through restaurant at 305 Ogden Avenue?
So moved. Second.
Questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments from the village council?
I just wanted to say one thing. I didn't know when the proper time was to say it, but I appreciate all the additional signage to satisfy the neighbors, so thank you for doing that.
I'm also going to add one thing in here. Last week, the petitioner, I'm not sure if it was an engineer, an architect, or the combination of the team, they addressed the resident who spoke last week's concerns right then and there at the meeting with not only a handout, we were able to provide the maps as well. That was some great service to our resident. Thank you very much for doing that. I think it helped. It showed another layer of safety and precaution that the petitioner has taken to make sure that this site plan works well and helps alleviate some of the traffic concerns that the neighboring residents had. So thank you very much for that extra service. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And I'll just say once again, anticipating a favorable vote, good luck. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, the matter passed unanimously. That brings us to item 8H, as in Henry. Do I have a motion to adopt an ordinance approving a redevelopment agreement with SDG Downers Grove LLC?
So moved.
Second.
Questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments from the village council? May I have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, that matter passes unanimously. And last, do I have a motion pertaining to item 8I, as in Irene?
Mayor Tully, I move to move item I, as in Irene, to the first reading agenda, portion of our agenda tonight.
Second.
Any questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments from the village council? Roll call on the motion to move that item from the active agenda to the first reading agenda.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Nay.
Commissioner Olson?
Nay.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, the matter passes 5-2. So that item will now be taken up as part of item 9 on our agenda, our first reading or our workshop agenda. And since we are now at the end of our active agenda, we'll go right to our first reading agenda. And do we want to come back to that one next to last? Take up the other two first?
Sure. Item 9A in the first reading was already covered and discussed as part of the public hearing earlier. That's this plat of subdivision approval for 5850 Janes. That will leave 3 items. The first 2 will be presented by our Public Works Director, Nan Newland, one for a bid award for sidewalk installation and another bid award for parking lot improvements. Nan.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening. As Dave said, I have 2 contract items to present tonight. The first is a request to award a contract for the 2014 new sidewalk installation program and right-of-way accessibility improvements to D. Natale Construction, Inc. of Addison, Illinois, in the amount of $571,639. This is a list of the sidewalk segments that we are planning to construct this year. This is one of 2 slides showing those for a total of 1.2 miles of new sidewalk. This work is directly related to the village's objective to install public sidewalk on at least one side of every street in the village, which improves safety and mobility within the community. In addition to this, as you see on the bottom 2, we have 2 right-of-way accessibility improvements. The first is at St. Joe's Church, and the second one is at McCullum Park. These are both within the public right-of-way. They're steep parkways and help accessibility into these heavily used areas. 2 public meetings were held with the residents to discuss the new sidewalk segments this year. We took a lot of public comment and made a lot of revisions to the plans to accommodate residents' concerns. And we will be having a 3rd meeting with them right prior to construction. We've also been hosting and doing meetings at the site with residents as they requested as well. And we will be out there painting proposed sidewalk locations and meeting with them again to talk about exact locations and landscaping and trees and all the things we can do to reduce impact on those properties. 4 bids were received for this contract, and the low bidder was D. Natale. They have successfully performed work for the village on the 2011 and 2012 new sidewalk program, as well as did work at the Washington Street Improvement Project last year. Staff recommends award of this project to D. Natale, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this recommendation.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Questions or comments from the audience? Questions or comments of the village council? Commissioner Rankin?
So at St. Joe's, is it going to be the stairway on Highland that's crumbling?
It's going to be a ramp right next to that area, right at the corner.
Okay. Okay, great.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Commissioner Durkin?
Yeah, thank you. My usual question every year, the sidewalk program, these sidewalks will be installed and up and running for the new school year?
Yes,
in the
they
fall? Awesome, glad to hear that. And then also just tip my hat to staff, and I got to hand it to Dave. I've been asking about 67 and Blackstone Drive for I don't know how many years, and to be able to come to an agreement with the Park District and to be able to get this done, really, I appreciate that, because it makes a heck of a lot of sense when you walk that area and you see the configuration of trying to get to the path into the northeast corner of McCullum Park. So thank you for getting that accomplished.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Barnett?
Do we have, I assume someplace we have a list of gaps, right? And is that, when we talk about progress within the matrix, is that included, or is that sort of a second list item?
It's kind of a secondary item. The last 3 bullet points on the new sidewalk list that lists the alternative bids, those are some gaps in some kind of heavily used sidewalk areas. And we will be looking at those, the remaining of those, when we look at our priorities for the sidewalk program moving forward later this year.
Are we, in general, intending to, well, we've got I shouldn't say a fair number of, in my neighborhood I come across them, so it seems like a fair number, but places where we have sidewalk that terminates at the street, and doesn't pick up on the other side. In a lot of cases, one side does and one side doesn't. So are we intending to fill those or just leave them because we can sort of accomplish the one side aspect, or what's the plan with those?
Are you talking about just the, kind of the ramp at the corner, where those are missing?
Yeah, you've got sidewalk on both sides of the street, comes up to a curb, one side picks up on the other side, the other one does not. So the parkway on the opposite side of the street has no ramp receiver, if you will.
We are working on those along with our street maintenance program. That's a requirement of the ADA regulations, that whenever we do modification to the street, we have to make sure that it complies with the ADA regulations. So for the many miles of streets that we're working on for maintenance this year, at each intersection, we look at those where there's some missing or where there's some existing ones that don't meet current ADA regulations, and we're bringing those up to regulations. If we can put them in compliance with regulations, we will. Where both of them cannot be put in and meet regulations, we take them, we'll either take out one. If there's one there and one missing, we'll take out the one that's there, or if we can add the second one, we'll add the second one. So there's two.
I've noticed several of them are probably questionable with compliance because there's extreme grade conditions.
It's either some extreme grade or there's a driveway right there. Per ADA, you can't use the driveway apron as an access. It has to be appropriate concrete ramp. So we kind of work through each of those as we get to them.
We're just hitting them through our street maintenance program.
As we do our street maintenance program.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other questions or comments?
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay.
Very good. Next item, please.
Our second contract is a contract to perform parking lot maintenance improvements for both Downers Grove, the village, at two of our fire stations, Stations 1 and 3, as well as at various locations in School District 58. And as you'll recall, we had an IGA with District 58 approved by council last meeting. District 58 approved that same agreement last night, as well as this bid to move forward. And we're recommending a request to award a contract for this work to Chicagoland Paving of Lake Zurich, Illinois, in the amount of $459,899. The village portion of the project is $201,920. The school district's portion of this contract is $257,979.22. This project consists of pavement resurfacing, reconstruction, marking replacement, removal and replacement of curbing, installation of storm sewer, and some minor sidewalk removal and replacement and restoration at Downers Grove Fire Station 1 and 3, El Sierra Elementary School, Indian Trail Elementary School, Whittier, and Pierce Downer Elementary Schools. We think this is a great partnership with District 58. We're able to work with them and assist with our staff, who's already in the process of putting together these contracts, making evaluations of parking lots. So it was a great partnership with them. And by combining them, we think we've received better bids for both of us. These are just two examples of two of the areas we'll be working on this year, very typical of a lot of the parking lot that both of us have in our systems that we're wanting to improve. We did advertise for bids. Chicagoland Paving was the lowest responsible bidder, and they have completed similar projects for local municipalities and school districts, including Lake Zurich School District, Lincolnshire, Prairie View School District, and Village of LaGrange. And staff recommends award of this contract to Chicagoland Paving. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Any comments, questions from any members of the audience with respect to this contract? Questions or comments from members of the Village Council? Commissioner Newstead?
It's no shock that this is a great connection between two municipalities within the same corporate limits. I guess the question goes is, you know, we've seen some of the mayors and managers conference connection to this. Dave, in your managers meetings, have you shared with other DuPage County municipalities this kind of municipal connection and partnership? I know we've got the crack fill seal contract last week. But it seems like there might be some other, just kind of that neighborly suggestion to our friends around the county.
Yes, we have talked about these types of partnerships. Some of the partnerships are across municipalities where two villages or more, we get together to bundle contracts and get better pricing. This one is an example of the village at a school district. We have shared this idea with other municipalities. Some of them are starting to do it. The next evolution of this is actually to take both types of partnerships and put them into one type of agreement where it doesn't matter if you're a municipality or a district or a different kind of government. We're seeing that approach by some of our other municipalities up in the north suburbs right now.
Thank you. It'll be very interesting I'm sure it'll work great, but it'll just, I'm interested as an employee of the school district to see how this progresses through our 5-year and long-range planning at the district, as this being the first year with this type of partnership. We've had partnerships for many years and other things, but it just seems to really make sense to utilize the experts in the fields in the municipalities. So I know that I'm going to throw a little shout out for District 58 too. We've reciprocated a little bit in some of our teachers coming, mostly to the fire station for the public safety classes, and it's not quite the same amount of money impact that we're talking about here, but it certainly is a good partnership back and forth between the village and the school district. So thank you to everybody for the hard work getting this put together. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other questions or comments? My only request is that in the fall, we get 2 after pictures.
We'll definitely do that.
Those, I'm sure it wasn't just all this winter that did that.
For the record, I don't plow that particular spot.
This is pretty ugly. Thank you for the presentation. Presentation of those items.
Thank you, Mayor. The next item is further consideration of an ordinance amending our zoning ordinance. This is a high priority action item that we've been working on for several months. We did anticipate a vote, and that's why it was placed on the active agenda, but we've learned that there are potential further discussion items from the council, so we did move it to the first reading to facilitate further discussion. This is a very important document, and we want to take as much time as necessary to make sure we get the zoning ordinance that works for our community. We have no further staff presentation, so we'll turn it back over to the mayor and the council for any questions or discussion.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. And just for those of you that are keeping score at home, this used to be active agenda item 8I as in Irene, that has now been moved to our first reading agenda item. So I guess it's 9I. And as the village manager indicated, the purpose, as I understand it, was to have an opportunity to discuss some fairly discrete, well-articulated issues. And I will ask Commissioner Barnett, as the principal author, to introduce them, because I think that's probably the most expedient way to go through. And my understanding is that we're going to go through them and basically, with respect to each item, decide whether it's something that we do want to actually have done, in which case that will be direction to staff to actually have it in the ordinance for next week for a vote, or there will be a direction to put something together that can be considered for a vote next week. Or the third item would be that there's really no interest in the council in even preparing something that would be considered for a vote next week. But all this is leading up to a common theme, which is a vote next week. And I think that's the goal of this discussion. So we're going to go through these items pretty, I don't want to say quickly, but they're very succinctly described and defined. At least I understand them to be. And I know that Commissioner Barnett has already discussed with some or most of us what they are in advance, so we should be familiar with them. But it probably makes sense, especially since this is a workshop item. Commissioner, if you wanted to sort of lead us through the different items as the principal author and proponent, that probably, I think, is the most efficient way to go.
Sure, be happy to. Thank you, Mayor. It's not often that discreet or succinct are used in conjunction with anything I say or do, so that's awesome. I appreciate that. Well thought out, I guess, is what remains to be seen, right? So there were a couple of items, I guess it's 11 points, which were right before we finally decided to approve this thing. There's some issues. Some of them are technical in nature, some of them are policy kinds of questions that I'd like just additional consideration from my colleagues on. So starting at the beginning of the list here, I think maybe the fastest thing and the quickest way to do this is just go straight through them, and I suspect in some cases there'll be 5 quick head nods or 6 quick head nods, no way. And that's okay too, but if there are things that get somebody's attention and there's some appeal to, I'd like to talk about those and see if we can't amend it. In the beginning, there's a couple of things too. I'm wondering if everybody's working from sort of the most recent version. I hope we are, because there have been some changes along the way that affect these as well. On page 47, and my page reference now is the most current version that was found online, posted Friday. So if you're working from the oldest version like this, it may not be exactly the right page. Page 47 in particular, under the definition of a PUD, There's some additional wording that I'd suggested here to try and sort of further underscore that the PUDs need not accomplish all the goals that are listed as possible goals. PUDs, I think, offer both the petitioner and the village unique opportunities for not only management of a larger, typically, site, but also future control over how that site's developed in relationship to other documents that might not be in the zoning ordinance, in particular planning documents like long-range plan, like the comp plan, like pattern books for downtown, for instance. And so I'd like to say in the PUD section that the second sentence under the 4.7 definition, say, this is point 2, in general, however, PUDs are intended to include design elements which address some or all of the following objectives, that's as opposed to intended to accomplish the following objectives. It's a little looser definition, but I'd like to underscore that that looseness is a value both to the village and to the petitioner, and just kind of set that standard going forward. So at any point, if somebody wants to say, yeah, I like that idea, that'd be great, or if they say, no, you're nuts, that's cool too.
I think for the perspective of staff, we should go at each item and kind of say yes, so we can give some clear direction, so we can prepare for our next vote. I'll start with this particular change. I am fine with the amendment that Commissioner Barnett has put forward, or the language change.
I'm fine with it as well, as long as it reads in general, comma, however, PUDs should include design elements that further some or all of the following objectives. I think it's the same intended purpose, but my only concern is that address is probably not the right word. I think we want to further these concepts. I'd just like it to be more of a encouraging type of word,
Sure.
so that's really the only difference.
Sure.
But I have no problem with it.
That accomplishes my goal, to be sure.
I support that.
I do as well.
Fine.
Sounds unanimous on that one.
7-0.
Should,
Madam Attorney,
one more time, please.
keep
Mr.
us
Mayor.
honest. I will slow down. In general, comma, however, comma, PUDs should include design elements that further some or all of the following objectives.
Thank you.
Page 5.2, this is the table you're all, I'm sure, pretty familiar with, which lists the various zoning districts and uses and tables them as either permitted, not permitted, or special use. There are two changes here that have to do with eating and drinking establishments. The first one is we right now, is in the current proposal, separate or treat differently, rather, restaurants and wine boutiques as it relates to OR and ORM districts. I'm not sure I understand what the logic behind that would be. The uses in practice that certainly we've experienced here in the village since the introduction of kind of wine boutiques would suggest to me that they're very similar enough to restaurant activities that they need not be separated as it relates to OR and ORM districts. I'd like to see us put wine boutiques on the same plane as restaurants and make them special uses in OR and ORM districts.
I guess my only question is, why wouldn't they be? That was the question I've been asking myself since we had the conversation. I can't think of a reason why they wouldn't be.
Yeah, I don't know.
What's something I'm missing?
So I just want to be real clear. The restaurant, as I see it, is a special use in OR and a permitted use in ORM, subject to footnote 8.
Correct.
Are you suggesting the same?
That they be treated the same way.
The same way. So a special use, subject to footnote 12 in OR, and a permitted use subject to footnote 8 in ORM.
Correct.
Seems logical to me.
Staff has no objection to this change. It reflects the history of how the wine boutiques came into being through text amendments, so we're fine with this change.
And there's the further protection, of course, of the liquor control aspect of it. They would also have to go through that process for a wine boutique, so there's,
right.
I don't see any distinction between those two personally.
I would agree with that. It's fine.
It seems like head nods around on that.
Does anyone object to that change?
That's a good question.
That's
I do not object.
I'm trying to get,
Better way to
direction
frame
here. Without objection. Hearing no objections.
All right, so the first in the same chart there, and we're in the same section, eating and drinking establishment. This is the first more policy-related question, if you will. We, right now, do not list we don't list DT, downtown transition, as a possible, as restaurants or wine boutiques, as a possible use in DTs. We show them as not possible, neither permitted nor special use. I would like us to consider making them both special uses in DT. As I try and think to not only this community but others and our sort of evolution of our downtown, the idea that we would have some restaurant or wine boutique capabilities in some of our particularly older homes that are immediately adjacent to the DT or to the DB but are zone DT. That seems to me like a privilege I'd like to extend. One thing about, there's a special use versus permitted use, and RS is really Ps. If you suggested that they be put there as a function of requesting a zoning change, the zoning change would be to a DB, which would then make it a permitted use, which would remove sort of any and all control we have. There's not a whole lot of control in a special use. But if you said, well, I like that idea and I could live with it, but I think the proper control method is a zoning change request by an applicant, that removes any control we have. And so I'd like us to consider that. Now, there are certainly scenarios we could all dream up that would be horrific and some that would be great. But I think that's true in almost any instance where we have a non-residential use adjacent to a residential, whether that be a business or it be a drive-through or it be a manufacturing or it be any of these uses. There are conditions we could all dream up that would be a disaster. This one, I think, if you look at our downtown and the amount of kind of encroachment into residential facilities that have now become parts either of the DT or the DB itself, I think there's some value here. If we think back in time a little bit, what is now Oakley's I guess office or headquarters, it used to be the tea room. I suspect that at one point in time was a residential home. Whether it was ever zoned DT, I don't think, because I think DT came after that. But the idea that these buildings might be converted and used in that manner, certainly communities such as both Elmhurst and Geneva and Naperville all have very similar situations. I don't think they have DT zoning districts, so that's one thing that distinguishes us from them. But I'd like to see us consider making special use accommodations for restaurants and wine boutiques in DT.
If I could jump in real quick. This, as the first of the more policy-oriented issues that Commissioner Barnett is raising, really highlights why I didn't vote in favor of pulling it off of active and putting it on first reading, because I think this deserves more than what we might give it tonight, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I'd like, whether or not this type of commercial use, a restaurant, belongs in the buffer zone that is the downtown transition as you get more toward residential uses, I think is a topic worthy of further conversation. And I'd like to see us take it up, whether it's under new business or a long-range planning item, something like that. And the same goes for a couple of the other ones down the line. Our current code was passed in 1965. That's not to say that it was stuck in time. It was amended along the way. And sometimes those amendments took place quickly, sometimes they took a while. But for that reason, I'd like to see us move forward with the code and whatever other amendments might come out of tonight. But things like this, the extended family accessory housing, a couple of other items down the line, I think deserve additional discussion and study before we decide whether or not to give them a head nod, up or down.
Just to pick up on that, I'm intrigued by the question, and I understand the question, I understand the issue, and I understand the reasoning behind it. I too think that is something that's worthy of more consideration, but certainly more consideration than either tonight or between now and next week would allow. So my inclination would be not to make the change now, nor to prepare something to vote on next week, because I'm not prepared to do that. But I understand the issue. I think it goes in the hopper with some other issues like mobile vendors and food trucks and things that we know we want to do something about, but we're not going to jump in and deal with them right here in this document tonight. So I tend to agree. I think it's a valid issue to look into. I understand back and forth, and I just think that there's more. I would certainly need to think about it more and have more information before doing that, because I can envision both of those scenarios too, and I, in my own mind, haven't figured out where I would draw the line, and I'm just not capable or willing to do it with drawing a letter in a box right now, I guess is what I'm saying.
So if that would be the case, when would you see this coming up for further discussion?
Well, one option would be if we actually had a petitioner who came to us and said, I'd like to do this, how do we do it? And then the facilitate, not regulate component comes in, and they go through and talk with Tom and staff and say, well, this is what we, they'll remember this conversation.
Well, we also
and
had
go
a
through.
vendor, we also had a potential vendor who's allowed to work in our neighboring communities to sell food and trucks. So I would support doing what both of you have stated. I just want to have a timetable of when we're going to.
Sure, because it's got to be well thought out. We can't just say, do it, and then suffer the consequences. I just, again, my own perspective, kind of look at this as how we might address a situation where someone can come to us and say, hey, you don't allow a certain kind of restaurant because you don't have a license classification for
we've been
for that.
quick to address.
And then we figure out what it is, we have some idea of what's coming, and then we, if it seems like it makes sense, we will categorically create that license, not for that particular petitioner, but knowing what the concept is that they're seeking to have a license for, and then they have to go through the process for it. So I'm not completely against the concept. I think it could work out very well. I think I just would have to have more purposeful and mindful and concrete analysis of it for me. But in terms of a timetable, I mean, that's driven by us and the capacity of our fabulous staff.
I would agree with what Martin and Greg were saying. When I look at the map, I see lots of DT and it spreads beyond downtown, and that's what worries me about it, I don't think we could say that it have to be, a DT immediately abutting a DB, and then we would allow that because that's not how it works. So, that's where I would be really okay with it. But then when you're looking at, Carpenter Street, way on the other side, if that's an allowed special use, I mean, that's where it gets a little hairy for me, so. I would be interested in what you were saying and looking at it further at another time.
It sounds like a no to me.
Yeah.
Trying to keep it moving.
Yes, not now.
I mean,
That's what I was going to
I appreciate everybody chiming in. I mean, that's the purpose of doing it this way and going through this stuff. So.
Well, it's a no in the sense that it sounds like no one wants that to be prepared for a vote next week. That's the answer. It doesn't mean we're never going to look at the issue.
So now I'm on 6.5.
Oh, this one's easy.
They're all easy. Just do it my way. That makes it real easy.
You'll see later on in life, Bob.
Commissioner Durkin's got a great answer to that. I've heard him use it before.
Yeah, I bet.
It's a two-letter word.
The question is extended family housing. So the issue here is the idea of creating essentially living quarters, kitchen, bathroom, secondary entrance, living quarters in existing homes. As the proposed ordinance suggests, we would allow that on attached homes, not on detached homes. The concerns, as I understand them, kind of historically and behind the current wording, have to do with concerns about, creating situations where people essentially are building facilities to rent. I think that's a totally valid concern. I'm fairly certain that, a huge majority of our population would not want us to create a situation where folks were encouraged in some way to create rental parcels within or on their own properties. But we address that, I would suggest, in items D and E in particular, where we talk about that these rentals, even on attached facilities, may only be to blood relatives or through marriage. We also say specifically no additional roomers or boarders are allowed. Interestingly, in E, we say in any detached house, although we're not going to allow detached houses. My point on this, bringing this up, is really two aspects. The first one has to do with sort of what I perceive as not only the demographics, but the cultural environment that we're in. Historically speaking, the idea of multiple generations under one roof is pretty common. It waned a bit with, challenges to middle-class wages over the last 20 years, baby boomers, and a huge portion of the population that are aging, the extraordinary costs of dealing with that. I know of several situations in town that are relatively recent, where you have 3 generations and and folks have created these exact settings. My question is, why do we suggest that that's okay as long as the building is attached? So if your neighbor wants to take their attached garage that's just an attic and convert it to an in-law dwelling with all the facilities and access, that's okay. But if the garage is 3 feet away, it's no longer okay. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think some of the existing prohibitions that are in here against turning stuff into rental property for the general public is entirely appropriate, but I don't think treating a garage that's attached differently than a garage that's attached makes a lot of sense. And frankly, I'd like to encourage people to be able to do that. So that's my issue here.
What say you?
I think that, not knowing the history of since back to 1965 or whenever this revision was made, it seems to me like if you're having a detached garage situation, let's say, even with an accessible attic via staircase, the improvements to that garage may not be adequate or sufficient enough to really come up to our code. Somebody in a weekend project can turn their garage attic into a dormer bedroom with a bed and a dresser, but does it have the facilities as far as, a residential structure would require, bathroom facilities, operating plumbing, things like that. So, kitchen, who knows? I think this one for me this one's a little bit harder just to say yes or no. I don't know that there's too many opportunities like this around town. I can think of some, man caves above garages that are not really dwelling units, but more of, rumpus type rooms. They don't have bathrooms, they don't have,
Rumpus.
That's making it in the minutes.
It's all right, Jeff, I got the same book.
I just flashed back to 1965, sorry. So, this one to me, is it going to cause me to vote no on the entire zoning ordinance? No. But I don't know that we need to make this change. I would also put this in the category if somebody wants to come and ask us to change it,
Right.
then we can handle that request on a use-by-use basis.
Well, you can't handle the use-by-use basis on this. Some guy wants to do this to his garage. There's not a chance that this council or the next one is going to change our zoning ordinance for one guy that wants to put a bathroom in his garage. It's zero.
There's a chance?
No.
Well, we're not really
Come
going
on.
to change it to
But-
one particular
No.
parcel either. It's got to be, it's
No.
our
Right.
village-wide, or it's not.
The issue, I think, I don't mean to totally turn this into a debate, but the idea that somebody can build something substandard, that's true with every single home and every single remodel. We have rules about changing your kitchen, about changing your bathroom plumbing, and they get followed and they don't get followed. It's no different for this. If a guy decides to do this above his garage that's attached or above his garage that's detached and doesn't say anything to anybody, we're only going to know about it when somebody complains. And then they'll either have done it per the code or not. You have to sort of make the assumption with this that everybody's going to follow the rules about permitting and about construction methods, because there's nothing that says they do that right now in their home without the accessory residence issue. We enforce all of our code based on one thing and one thing only, that's complaints. You can't take an 1.5-inch document with 18,000 parcels and figure you're actually enforcing your code. You're not. We're not going to, we don't do it. So when people do construction on their home, when they put a deck on the back, we only know they put a deck on the back for one of two reasons. They asked, got permission, and did it right, or they got busted by their neighbor. And I guarantee there's decks all over town that weren't permitted. It's no different for this or any other aspect of construction in town. So I guess, the concern about inferior construction is warranted, but it's no different for any other aspect of construction on any house in town. It's not unique to this accessory residence aspect of it.
While everyone's pondering that, I just want to clarify that as I understood it or perceive it, option 1 is, yes, it's going to be in what it's actually going to be the body of the ordinance that's going to be up for a vote next week. Option 3 is it's not going to be in the body of the ordinance that we're going to vote on next week. Option 2 is write it up so we can all see it, and if someone is willing to do so, they can make a motion to amend the ordinance next week with that pre-crafted amendment on a particular issue. I just want to point that out, that and I'm just picking up a comment that Commissioner Newstead said, is that I don't think it would cause someone not to vote on the entire ordinance, because we'd be taking up these amendments as amendments, is how I understood it. But so far I haven't heard that there's any option twos out there, but I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that's what I had perceived it to be.
It's the instigator for the night, if you will, Mayor. That's, I would suggest that if there's something that somebody wants to think some more about, the process forward for those kinds of issues would be exactly that. In my mind, it would be a proposed amendment at next week's meeting. That amendment itself could be up or down. Either way, it would not prevent the ordinance from going forward next week.
Right. I just want to point that, not that I'm suggesting that anybody take me up on that, but that when I described those three different paths, that was the second one. And again, it would be literally the proposed, we're not talking about this conceptually, we're talking about the actual language changes that Commissioner Barnett has proposed. That would be the amendment. That would be the proposed amendment, that if someone moved to add it next week, they could do that. But obviously, if there isn't support for that tonight, it's unlikely to happen. But it could. Sure. That's all I wanted to point out. Commissioner Rankin? I'm really concerning.
I just wanted to say that I agree with Commissioner Barnett's change. It seems illogical to have, if you have an attached garage or a detached garage, that we have different rules, because it's the concept of allowing someone to have their in-laws live with them. So I would agree with his change.
Mayor, we'd like to have the opportunity to understand how a code change that allows somebody to construct a detached structure that is by definition a dwelling unit relates to other sections of our ordinance, including accessory structures. We need to understand, when is it a house and an in-law house versus two houses, and the interplay among construction codes, life safety codes, accessory structure regulations, setbacks, and other things in the zoning ordinance can get quite complex very early. And what we want to avoid is an intention where the council says in-law type arrangements above existing garages are okay, but we don't want people to build two houses on one lot.
You actually anticipated what I was going to raise, is that I suspect that there may be other issues, no disrespect to the very comprehensive approach that Commissioner Barnett's taking, but this has now caused a number of things to pop in my head. So I would probably personally would throw it in the category of, I understand it, I get it, I think it's something that we might want to look at, but I would also be very interested in that interplay. I don't think I'm prepared to either suggest that tonight or even next week.
It would take us a lot longer than 1 week to understand all those interplays and present to you a well-thought-out policy discussion.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming down. I can't, as I sit here, tell you what the distinction is, but I just have this gut feeling there's more to it than that.
I think that distinction is I mean, that's a exact observation. I mean, it's a great observation, and it's one certainly that we all need to be concerned about. My suggestion in this note and in this proposed wording is certainly not to allow secondary homes. But the wording that's there right now would prevent somebody from taking their detached garage and doing that, converting that usage, and that doesn't seem equitable, fair. I don't know how you want to word it, just because it's detached. So if a guy puts a breezeway in, is it attached now? I mean, we're talking about two different subjects: the conversion of existing facilities to accommodate living quarters versus building one to be a secondary living quarter. I think they're two different things, and the wording right now would prevent them both, which doesn't seem reasonable.
Others have heard from Commissioner Barnett. I think you heard from me, Commissioner Rankin. I think Commissioner Jose previously flagged where he was at on this.
Yeah, I'm interested in hearing more about it. I share some of the concerns that the mayor has raised and staff has raised. I want to make sure we're not going to create a loophole that somebody could drive a truck through.
Commissioner Olson?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I don't think this is something I want to consider before we vote on the ordinance.
Okay. Commissioner Durkin, Commissioner Newstead?
Again, it's not going to make
first, the other guy doesn't have to say anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, certainly don't want to create a problem for, is a garage a dwelling or is it an accessory structure? So I think more information on this one is important to get before we make the decision.
Okay. Well, that sounds to me like something that's not going to be prepared on this next week. Unless someone disagrees with my read.
Your math is accurate.
Thank you. Well answered.
614 is another section here. This has to do with nursing homes. And before I jump in too far here, Enzo, were you able to do any word massaging beyond what's Friday's edition?
I'm not for circulation.
Okay.
I understand the change, I
Okay.
looked at it, but I did not circulate.
So there are two issues here. One of them is pure technical wording kind of a thing. D, E, and F taken together talk about setbacks, landscaping, and screening, and vehicle access. We touch on each of those elements in different places within the code. We touch on them in parking, and we touch on them in a section called screening. I'd like to have us include in here, at the very least, reference to those other sections. And part of the reason is because the usage of this document, in my mind, has got multiple possibilities. Certainly, this council is one, our staff is one, developers are another one. Developers I'm not real worried about because they're going to be talking to our staff who's going to have this thing memorized. But when the neighborhood residents get their 250-foot mailed notice about something, I'd like to make it easy for them to understand what it is we're likely to try and encourage or require, particularly these issues. When we hear from people up here, we hear about traffic, we hear about stormwater, we hear about, I don't want to see it. It's going to be too bright, it's going to be too loud, it's going to be too intrusive. So all I'm asking for there is that in those sections of D, E, and F, we put wording in there that refers people back to the other sections so that it's really easy for a layperson to find out that we've got pretty hefty requirements, because there's some really good, heavy requirements in here. I just want to make sure everybody's aware of it in public.
Yeah, just taking that part of it, I don't see any reason why we couldn't do a reference. In fact, to me, whether it's a C section on screening or a C section on parking restrictions in F, or it's a hypertext link or something that makes it user-friendly, that's fine. It's a good suggestion as far as I'm concerned.
We'll make that change for next week, no problem.
The second section under nursing homes is a little more thorny, a little more policy perhaps. Paragraph G, rehabilitation therapy services. I suspect that the thorn in this, if you will, is the fact that what we're trying to talk about and identify it here is rehabilitation therapy services performed at a nursing home, but for potentially non-residents. I think that's what we're trying to address here. The way it's written, though, however, is unclear enough to me, and I think to others, that it could be read, interpreted to prevent some of those rehabilitation therapy services, in particular mental illness, alcohol, and substance abuse services, from being provided to the residents as well. So I'd like us to find some new wording for this section that clarifies that. I certainly understand the idea that we don't want necessarily our nursing homes to take up the new business model of being a destination for treatment. But I think it's really important that we don't even accidentally say that our nursing home shouldn't be engaged in mental illness rehabilitation and therapy.
On this one, if there was an option two for me, this would be it, because if the village attorney, I don't disagree with what you described, if the village attorney can propose language, I'd consider it next week if you have it. That would actually be an option two as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it would have to be worded in the way that,
It would be a very simple fix, and I think Commissioner Barnett's correct. The intent was for non-residents, the rehabilitation services would be restricted for non-residents for those services. It would be offered for the residents, but for non-residents, it would not include those rehabilitation.
The residents of the home.
Of the home.
right.
So we would just include the phrase for non-residents at the end of that clause.
Is that right? Any objection to proceeding with that proposed language, and then we can do that next week?
Yep.
As an amendment? Sure.
Yes. Well, I would include it in the new version that would come out on Friday, if that's okay.
I mean, as long as the language is
Yeah. It would be
okay for the
pretty
legal
simple.
department, it's okay with me.
Okay.
Mayor, Commissioner Brennan, did we talk about E, the specific language on landscaping and screening for E?
It was a C another section.
It was a C another section suggestion.
Oh, so that's just
what
going
is
to
screening? It would say see the section.
see the section on
screening.
screening, which defines what the screening is. I understand, thank you.
Yes. And then in F, it would see the section on
Yeah,
parking.
no,
restrictions.
I get it.
So that's basically saying what kind of bushes you can plant in your new estate you're moving into soon.
Olson Arms.
Casa de Olson.
Yeah.
Six.
All right. Got another easy one for us?
This one's probably not so easy. 619. This has to do with religious uses, religious assembly uses. For me, it's I think it's an inappropriate thing, whether it's existing in our code or proposed in the new zone ordinance, for us to be defining religious uses by area. I suspect that the goal in general here, probably in the existing ordinance and also in the proposed ordinance, is to try and mitigate some of the impacts of use, because clearly a religious use can become an enormous impact on a neighborhood of any kind, whether it's a ORM business or residential. But when we say that we're going to put acreage minimums on those uses, they start to feel to me awfully close to kind of barriers to entry that aren't appropriate. I think we have a lot of good code here in some of those areas we just talked about, whether they're parking requirements or screening requirements. I think that those impact concerns are best addressed with requirements about screening, setbacks, parking, lighting, drainage, etc., than they are choosing one particular use in a district, a religious use in our district, and saying it has to have a certain minimum acreage requirement. We have lots of examples of existing religious assembly uses in those neighborhoods that don't meet those requirements today. And if you just consider, property values in Downers Grove, whether it's, B1, 2, 3, DT, ORM, or R, a 2 to 4 acre minimum requirement means you're, talking about millions of dollars as a sort of a beginning entry point where somebody could begin to operate a religious assembly in one of those areas. So I'm really opposed to that. For me, that's it's a huge issue. It's a potential, I don't want to throw down any kind of gauntlet, but it's kind of a potential deal breaker to me. We're doing a lot of things that are real positive steps forward, relative to those impacts in a lot of instances, not just for religious assembly, but a lot of our screening and parking and stuff here is really good progress for our village to try and mitigate some of those impacts, regardless of the use type. But if somebody wants to buy a parcel in the B district and he wants to put up a 200-person office or sales place or whatever, and as opposed to a 200-person on a Sunday afternoon, I'm not sure that we should be telling them they have to have a land size difference. That to me just feels wrong, and I'm really opposed to it. So I'd like us to remove the acreage size requirements from those two sections here.
I can support that because it's still a special use in the R district and a special use in most other districts, but for the OR district.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting we remove the wording that talk, in particular the R district, Jeff, that talks about fronting on an arterial or collector street. So, that has a role too.
That was a question that we had when we talked. Are those two classifications in line with how we classify our roadways?
Yes.
I think so. I know that we have secondary, we have primary.
The primary and secondary is for snowplow operations, but for subdivision and zoning, we use these terms, arterial, collector, et cetera.
Okay, just a clarification there. Thank you.
I concur. For my part, I've got less of a problem with the ORM removing that restriction. That my only concern with a residential district would be a very small parcel with not a lot of parking suddenly turns into a very well-populated church, and the impact on the neighborhood in terms of parking and whatnot. Now, granted, it's probably only a couple of days a week, but I'd be interested to know if we have other ways than the acreage requirement to mitigate that sort of impact on the neighborhood.
Yeah, there are several tools available in the zoning approach to mitigate impacts. This is just one of a package approach. Minimum acreage fits with the other ones. You can certainly use other tools in varying degrees.
As far as I'm concerned, we can get to the same issue different ways, and I think Commissioner Barnett said at the very beginning, there's impacts that you're trying to avoid, and if we can avoid the impacts through other criteria, including the special use analysis, without the necessity of a minimum lot coverage or acreage size, and I don't think I have a problem with it. My main concern is that we don't open the door to any unintended consequences through impacts. Now, as a Side note, I don't even know how often this would even come up, but I understand that you're thinking prospectively and where it might come up. I'm not aware of any instances where this has been an issue in recent history here at Downers Grove. But as long as we're still making sure that the impacts are obviated, I don't have a problem with that. If that's the assessment of staff, that would be the case. And essentially, all intents and purposes, we'd really be talking about the same thing. Okay.
I don't know if there's any, people head nodding or
I thought I heard four.
We heard that as remove the acreage minimums on the ORMs, ORs.
Does anybody have an
and
objection to
Rs.
it?
Okay, thank you.
710. This is one I suspect will go down in flames, but I'm going to bring it up anyway.
Well, you can't have more 3 in a row.
This is parking of recreational vehicles and equipment. The wording that I'm chasing appears two places, both in A1 and B1. I'd like us to remove the opportunity to store recreational vehicles in the side yards. There are certainly a number of places in town, and new lots, as our minimum lots are defined, would probably accommodate this well. But there's a whole lot of town that's, northeast side of town / east side of town, where you've got a huge number of quarter-acre lots and homes right next to homes, right next to driveways, right next to homes. And if you start putting RVs as parking in the driveway of the side of a house, your neighbors, that's all they're going to see. So that to me is bothersome. Part of the ordinance, my reading of this, a little broader question, was not so much about what needs fixing, but what do I wish it was like. So that's part of the driving here. I think that allowing people to park RVs in the front is not a lot different than allowing them to park it in the side, particularly when you're talking about a string of quarter-acre lots with houses all at the same point. So, there you go.
I am not in favor of this change. I think that a lot of people who make the investment in a RV, whether it's small, big, medium, large, have done their research, and in one way, they've looked at Downers Grove. At least I would imagine this is what happens when you go to buy an RV. Hopefully, you look to see where you can park it before you purchase the sometimes very expensive RV. And in the case in my mind that I'm thinking is resident goes to buy an RV, knows he can park it in his side yard or his rear yard, constructs a driveway or a parking pad in compliance with our current zoning ordinance. It's a big investment, and while it is something that, some neighbors may not be interested in looking out at, I understand Commissioner Barnett's concern about where it's located on the property. I do think that if we make this change, there's a number of residents that are going to be all of a sudden not compliant and have outlaid a large investment for not only the recreational vehicle, but perhaps an improvement to their property to park the vehicle. I can think of at least one on Saratoga that I know of by our old house. Once the RV is parked, and I'm not going to say it blends in, but it does have its spot. And, I think we've had, in my tenure up here, one complaint about RV, and that was actually quite recently. And we do have ways for residents to screen and try to create a buffer for RVs in their neighborhood. So I'm not interested in changing this one. I appreciate the thought process from Commissioner Barnett, but I think this one for me is leave the same or go with staff's recommendation on this one, the draft proposal.
I agree with Commissioner Newstead on that.
He's going down in flames on this one.
Yeah, he's going down in flames on this one.
Kind of suspected it.
I would support Commissioner Barnett's change. I would like to add in the caveat that I think people should be allowed to park them temporarily, in case they're maintaining them, loading them, unloading them, things like that. But I agree with the rest of Commissioner Barnett's analysis completely.
And I agree with Greg and with Bob.
Well, my concern is similar to what Commissioner Newstead said, that when you boil down the Hippocratic Oath into the typical one sentence, it's first do no harm. And my fear is that we don't have a lot of complaints about this right now, and I'm pretty sure that if we change this, we have a lot of complaints. Or, because I had to look up the definition of rumpus, It's a usually noisy commotion. I think right now, there's maybe one complaint every now and then. It's not a big deal. If we made this change, we'd have a rumpus on our hands. And that goes against the Hippocratic Oath.
Well, actually, if I'm not mistaken, there are 20, 25 complaints a year somewhere in that neighborhood, Dave.
In the last 5 years, we get between 18 and 25 complaints of RV category, which includes RV trailers and boats.
Yep. And there are only about 118 or so registered in the village, according to the Secretary of State. FOIA is a great thing.
Mark my words.
I'm just saying.
Well, I lived this in Darien, and you're right, it was a big deal, but, the public did come out. I stick my point, I stick with Bob.
All right, this is one.
That's Durkin, D-U-R-K.
Yeah, he's at 837 Bonnie Brae.
One thing.
RV going in next.
I think we'll be living in it, there's gonna be jack stands, oh yeah, and, oh, come on, I don't wanna relive that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I've continued to read this thing and probably will through the end of next meeting. So let me bring up one small thing that nobody knows about here except the mayor. Number 6 in B6 in the same section. If I could get some description from staff of what the purpose of making sure that these parked RVs are licensed is. I'm not sure why we do that, because whether they're storing them or working on them or trying to sell them, I could see a whole lot of situations where they're not licensed, and I don't know what the value to the village of ensuring they are licensed is.
Well, I recall an incident, and I think the purpose of that was so people weren't just storing all their stuff in their yard for a long period of time, and that they were actively using these things that were stored out in their yard.
It's an incentive to make sure it's a functioning RV as opposed to something that would devolve into debris.
Well, then I need a little more definition on license by next week, because I could see a situation where a guy's trying to sell his boat and he doesn't re-up the state watercraft license, and there it sits unlicensed.
Yeah. We can take a look at that. Our inspectors use a facilitate our regulate approach. If we see somebody taking strides to comply, we generally work with them, and we'll still get that information to you.
Okay.
So on this one, Commissioner Rankin,
I am.
You're the swing vote.
Yeah, I know. I do not agree with.
No voting, sorry.
Commissioner Barnett's proposal, because I think that there are people that have, whether, you may not want it next to you, they have, abided by our rules. They put a cat in, they have their RV there, and to all of a sudden take that away from them, I don't think that's really fair.
okay, there you go. That one's a no. Close no, but a no.
It didn't go down in flames.
Yeah, it wasn't so
No,
bad.
it didn't
It wasn't as
go
bad as I
in
thought. I thought I was going to get a hammer.
Tepid decline.
That's a tepid decline. I want to remember that one. Next has to do with screening. So this is really in Article 8. As opposed to this version, the bound version we got, there are some changes that are in there already, but I'd like to make some additional changes. The purpose of screening, in my estimation, is not to screen stuff from the users or the owners, but to screen stuff from the rest of the world, if you will. And so one of the issues that I still have here is, if we look at page 8.7 in the bound book, number 3, we're talking about roof mounted mechanical equipment. We're using a kind of a common tool, which is moving things back from a parapet wall so that the angle of viewing, if you will, causes the parapet wall height to obscure the view of the equipment. But that angle disappears like immediately as soon as you get off site. You get one lot, 2 lots away, you get out into the second lane of Ogden Avenue and closer to the middle, and pretty soon all those angle values attributed by moving back off the parapet are gone. You can still see it. Drive down Ogden Avenue, you'll see this. People have parapet walls, they move the equipment to the middle. We don't require any higher screening, and you can see it the whole way you drive down the street. So I think that some of the new wording, which talks about the screening to be at least as high as the tallest piece of equipment is screening, is perfect. I'd just like to see us remove this section 3 of screening on rooftops. I think that You have to have it screened, you have to have it screened as tall as the tallest piece of equipment, period. That's the first change. There's a second change here, so that's the first one.
So you're saying is that that apartment complex that you approved, because I was absent last week, you're talking about the screening on the roof if they had a higher condensing unit than what the screen itself was blocking?
That'd be one possibility. The rooftop mechanical equipment is a really common thing, and screening it is of value to all of us. And when you screen it as a function of a parapet wall, if the wall is not as high as the equipment, the farther you get away, the more likely you are to see the equipment still.
Correct.
So if you just say that the screen wall has to be at least as high as the equipment, you're done. It doesn't really matter. Now, obviously, you can go up elevation and still look down on top of it. But the idea of just putting it in the middle and hoping then that everybody's on site can't see it is not enough for me, because it doesn't screen it from everybody else, if you will.
It's fine with me. I just have a question. Would this be something, this requirement be subject to a variance request?
Yes.
So for whatever reason, it was a hardship that just made it, couldn't do it for whatever legitimate reason, we'd have that ability to give that flexibility?
Yes, all aspects of the zoning ordinance would be subject to a variation request.
Can I ask another question about why number 3 might have been in there? Is there any code or safety concern of why a, say, rooftop piece of equipment would want to be set back from the edge of the roof? I know that's a very technical question, but just reading it again, that popped into my head.
From a zoning perspective, no. We'll check into whether there's other codes that are influencing that.
Okay.
Jeff, to clarify what, setting it back from the edge of the roof, my comments and my screening issue doesn't really contemplate where, I don't know if I care where it is.
Gotcha.
They should put it on the edge, on the middle, wherever it's
I know
most
this is under
convenient for them.
the screening section, but if that relates somehow else to, not wanting to have a condenser right on the edge of the rooftop for whatever reason.
They can put it wherever they want, they just have to screen it.
Okay. I'm fine with this change.
Is anybody opposed to the change? Okay, and then part 2?
Part 2 has to do with some wording about screens, the screens themselves. We say in a couple of places, we say in the rooftop equipment, we also say again in the refuse recycling container screening, we use the word solid and we use the word opaque. And I'd like us to consider making that wording, I've got some proposed wording in that letter I floated around, but to talk about putting a minimum of 80% view blocking. Now, I don't know that I care if it's 70% or 80% or 90%. I'd certainly defer to staff if they have an opinion on that. But the issue here is twofold. A lot of times that equipment screening needs to have a certain amount of airflow because the equipment it's actually screening. That's one thing. So putting solid walls up can be detrimental to the equipment performance itself. The second thing is there are instances, the 2 examples that I'm most familiar with are the CHA and the Air Force, where screening is out there on purpose with some degree of site allowability for security purposes. So when we think about downtown Downers Grove dumpster enclosure, for instance, you wouldn't want, a drunk guy finding his way in there and passing out in the corner and not knowing about it. You wouldn't want a crime to be occurring in there, some sort of an assault. Having some degree of visual permeability, if you will.
Translucence.
Thank you. Some degree of it can be, I think, can be a safety thing. Now, if somebody on their private property wants to make a solid enclosure, have at it. But by commanding a solid enclosure, we don't allow people some of the freedom that they might need either for security or airflow. When we look at our dumpster enclosure downtown, if you look at that as an example, when you're standing immediately in front of it looking at it, it's pretty much translucent. As soon as you get any kind of angle, you get a huge amount of view blocking, which is great. But we just did that. I can think of good technical reasons, I think, to allow some screening. I don't like the idea of saying solid and saying opaque in the rule. I'd like to say at least 80%.
Fine. Bob, in your proposed change here, you talked about the appropriate design concrete or other paving material pad.
Yes.
I'm not sure what other, is that an appropriately designated other paving material, or is that, I'm more interested, I think concrete is a little bit more sturdy.
So the third,
Asphalt?
I'm sorry, Jeff, you brought up something I'd forgotten. The third question relative to this was, we talked about dumpsters and we talked about putting them on concrete pads. And the question I had was, if we're trying to encourage permeable pavers, we're trying to encourage surfaces that are permeable in one way, shape, or form, do we really want to compel a concrete pad to be installed? There's durability questions, although we just made a street out of it. There's, I suppose, runoff questions, because you're talking about refuse or grease traps or whatever, so that may be as a consideration why we wouldn't want to have it permeable. But I just wanted to ask the question, if we're trying to encourage stormwater considerations where we're doing as little solid surface work as we can, do we want to say, rather than compelling concrete, we want to say, or other suitable paving surface?
I can go along with that. I think the word appropriately designed concrete or other paving. I mean, if you design a paver patio and put a dumpster on it, first time a garbage truck comes to pick up that full.
Not going to work.
Not going to work. So as long as that appropriately is in there. I still think that concrete would probably be the best use for most applications, but I do appreciate the attempt to try to have an option there. And I'm also okay with the at least 80% screening change in this section.
And my only concern there, sorry, David, I didn't mean to jump on you there, but my only concern would be the runoff aspect that Commissioner Barnett mentioned, just making sure that we don't have to worry about any environmental impact of anything that might run off or out of the dumpster affecting the ground.
I'd prefer to leave the concrete alone, not add anything specific in that section. But the 80% is not an issue for me.
I support the changes.
So do I.
Anyone have an objection to the change?
Why objected to the one?
To the one. Any other objections?
No.
Sorry. Okay.
12.4 in the bound book, 12.3 in the most recent version talks about public notice. And we've touched on this 2 or 3 meetings ago, and perhaps I misunderstood it. I apologize if I did. But we talked about, this lists 7 sort of additional public hearing notices, methods for accomplishing public notice. If there's one thing we struggle with, it's people feeling like they've gotten adequate public notice. And so I recognize that there are other pieces of this ordinance that will compel certain additional notices. But I'd like us to just say here that at least items 1, 2, and 3 are always required. I don't know that, and I'm struggling for the right choice of words and not sound flippant up here. I don't know that I care what type of development or a permit you're applying for. If you're required to give public notice at all, I think we ought to require that numbers 1, 2, and 3 are done. 4, 5, 6, and 7, from where I sit, if we want to require those, that's fine. I'm neither here or there on those. But 1, 2, and 3 I think are important, and I think ought to be required action for everybody who's seeking a permit of some kind with us, where the public notice is required.
Is there a staff objection to this or concern?
No, there's no objection. That's the intent. However, I do want to bring up one exception, and that is when somebody makes a proposal for a text amendment. Text amendments usually apply universally or to one specific district or issue, and then there's no geographically specific location for which to measure notices. So text amendments are generally notices in the paper only, and no signs and no mailings within 250 feet. Other than that, it's the intent for all other petitions to have those 3 primary forms of notification.
Can we just say except for
We'll clarify it.
Yep.
in all other instances?
Correct.
The clarification will be also in the appropriate section.
Right.
That's fine.
Got it.
I do have a question, and I just brought it up, I just thought of it now while I was reading number 1 on the sign. Do we mandate or do we state what size sign the public hearing notice sign has to be on it? Is it at least a 4x8 sheet of plywood?
We dictate that they use signs that we provide, so in essence, we tell them what size it has to be, and we control that.
So whose sign is it?
It's our sign.
So do we rent the sign to them to use?
They pay a fee, yes.
And how big is the sign? Because I know that was one of the concerns about the slip being proposed on 63rd Street and Fairmount.
It's bigger than the podium.
Yeah, they're pretty big.
The technical answer is they're not very big.
They're not?
They're not very big.
It's bigger than a stop sign. It's like 2 stop signs wide,
Is there any way
and
that
3
we
stop
could
signs
look
tall.
at that or have staff look at that? I know that was one of the concerns. I know that Commissioner Jose had brought that up when he was talking about expanding the notification areas, or at least something.
Yeah, there were a couple of residents that.
Correct.
Yes, that's no problem. The good news is that's not really codified in an ordinance, so we can
That's
take
fine.
that up at
And
any
that's why I
time.
say, I just thought of it now as I was.
I mean, perhaps in, an area like 63rd Street, something different might be appropriate, but in a residential area where it's a 60-foot wide lot or 50-foot wide lot, the current sign, I think, is appropriate.
Yes, some towns have multiple size signs for that application, so there's certainly work out there. Sure.
You know, when we say it's not very large, I personally think they're fairly large. I go and look at them at times, so I can read them, so that's from the street.
When you're doing that 5K, can you read them?
Well, absolutely.
Well, we use our signs, though, because we can change the dates and the times for the meeting notifications, so that's why we can kind of control those.
That's fine. All I want is that we as staff look at making them bigger on the major thoroughfares.
So let's look at this as a conversation point. I think we just gave direction, but we also kind of alerted our staff to something that we feel like we could change. So David had a point of if it's a big street, and maybe if it's a multi-lot use, if it's anything above 2 lots, you put 2 signs up, even if they're the same signs, you just add another sign. We're not going out buying new sign blanks and making new signs.
Put rolling text.
Yep.
LED.
And put a QR code on it. Careful there.
Digital copy? What?
What?
Who's with me?
That one went down in flames now.
Just get that out there. Durkin advocated digital copy signs.
Yeah, you can tweet that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
So your original discussion was to require items 1 through 7, and now your request is to do 1 through 3? Require 1 through 4.
My recollection of this group's conversations in the past was that 1 through 3 were what was really important to folks. From where I sit, I think it's easier to just say you got to do them all, but I'm not, it doesn't, the others on there don't mean that much to me. I'm fine leaving them as possibilities.
Okay. I can support that. I couldn't support requiring them all, but that's fine.
Right.
Last one is page 1221, and it deals with the ZBA and their role in variation review. We have done some good things in here, in particular, I think, as it relates to administrative adjustments, tried to streamline the process, if you will, and minimize the number, to whatever degree we can via our code, the number of folks who need to see some other body, whether it's Plan Commission or ZBA. But I would like to find a way to, I'm going to start from the extreme. I would like to find a way to completely eliminate the ZBA in its role as it sits today. That being not really the purview of this meeting or next, because it's not something any of us talked about, and clearly it's a way bigger policy issue. But I'd like to see us retain the role of the ZBA as currently defined, as opposed to the slight expansion of review opportunities that they have. The issue of ZBA we could certainly talk about, and I'd be happy to get into it in depth why I don't like the concept and the current structure. But as it relates to the zoning ordinance presented and next week's intention to try and approve it, I'd like to see us just retain the current definition and current purview of the ZBA as opposed to expanding it like the proposed ordinance contemplates.
2 things. One on the broader question. Commissioner Barnett reminded me I'm the only person old enough to remember the discussion back when we had a zoning commission, a zoning board of appeals, and a plan commission. And there was a conversation about why we had all 3 and some of the confusion it created and additional costs and things like that. And we had a conversation back then, which had to be a decade ago at least, of given where we are now and what the what the flow of business is and the requests through the organization are and where we see ourselves going in the future, is that the best configuration? So I have no problem with, especially 10X years later, looking at whether the current setup is the best setup. I agree that's a much broader conversation than anything we're going to do tonight or next week. But I have no issue with, I think, actually one of the things on many different topics that we can do a better job of is revisiting things. And no matter what it is, this might be a good time to revisit something. And even if it's just, no, everything's been working fine, we like this structure, great. But that's not a topic for tonight or next week. On the requested changes, or actually not even changes, but basically don't make the changes.
Don't make the changes.
Is really what Commissioner Barnett is
My
stating.
request is to not make the change.
Yeah, the request is, the changes that have been put forth are there. Basically, Commissioner Barnett wants to pull them back and leave the status quo as it remains today. I actually have some follow-up questions that I'll bring up with the village attorney that I won't eat up everyone's time tonight on. But for the moment, I'm probably fine leaving the changes in as proposed. In other words, what's in the draft now for a vote next week. But I'll follow up with you later. I wouldn't be devastated if they were taken out, because we'd basically be dealing with what we've been dealing with for the last X decades. So I guess I'm deliberately being indecisive. I'd be fine either way.
So why were the changes made?
The current situation under the current zoning ordinance is that the Zoning Board of Appeals hears most of the variation petitions, but the Plan Commission hears variation petitions filed in conjunction with certain subdivisions and special uses. What that results then is, in some variations, the Zoning Board of Appeals hears them and they are the ultimate decision maker. In others, in these related cases, they flow through the Plan Commission as a recommending body, and then the council makes the final decision. This could result in a varying application of the zoning variation standards. And so the proposal was to have all variations go to the zoning board, so we have a greater likelihood that the standards are applied in a uniform manner.
Consistency.
Consistency.
And some might suggest consistently not the way they should be, but consistent.
And this is
Some
clearly,
might.
Some might.
this is a great example of an issue that's trade-offs: expediency, customer service versus technical application of standards, and some legal issues, making sure that we're not changing our code through varying approval processes or creating precedents in an unintended manner.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is staff recommending what's proposed?
Yes.
As a preferable to what we have currently?
Yes, we are recommending what is proposed.
Thank you.
For my part, I'd stick with the proposal in order to get that consistency. I think it's important to have the same decision maker on a consistent basis, so that you know that the decisions you're getting, or at least have a pretty good likelihood that the decisions you're getting follow one on the other. I would hate to see inconsistent application of the code when we can prevent it. As for the larger idea of increased flexibility, I'm 100% in favor of that. And I think we've seen a good step in that direction with giving staff the ability to do administrative variances without having to go to the zoning board, as long as it's within certain parameters. As for the larger question of the elimination of the ZBA, I think that's, as Commissioner Barnett said, a longer conversation. And I think it's potentially a very dangerous one. I would hate to see us go down the road of every variation coming to the council because it introduces the possibility for too much politics. And I'd rather have the appointed ZBA members taking care of that so that we don't run into situations where we might be swayed one way or the other by the presence of a crowd or by campaign donations or potential campaign donations, things like that. I think going with a ZBA to remove the politics from the situation is much preferable.
Understood, and there are valid issues on both sides of that, which is kind of why I think it is a much broader conversation. And when I said that it's an appropriate conversation, I wasn't necessarily meaning that that's the elimination of the ZBA. It's more that conversation happened a decade ago about what is the best structure, and it may be keeping them, but just now a different division of what they handle. I know that's part of what we're addressing right now. That's all I'm saying. I'm not suggesting we bring back the zoning commission. I know you really want that to happen.
Mayor, I think that in this particular case, obviously the administrative adjustments are an important, good step forward to let our staff, I think it's the third time, facilitate, not regulate. From my perspective, the current process of the Zoning Board of Appeals and how they operate, I think, is more closely in line with how we have been doing business in the village. I think that this village council has shown that it can look at the standards and look at them with a appropriate vantage point and view. And from my perspective, I would like to keep the zoning board in its current state and not go with the proposed change.
Commissioner Rankin?
Sean's head's in the way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Well, there's kind of valid points on either side of this argument, and I've expressed opinions previously, and I think I'm leaning towards keeping the ZBA the way it is and not changing it right now as proposed in the zoning ordinance. I think when it comes down to customer service and how we want to be as a village, to require applicants to take another step that they wouldn't necessarily have to take now is just creating time and money on a business owner or an applicant when the process seems to be working fine as it is. So that's where I stand.
Thank you, although I'm a little confused. I just want to make sure I understand you, I'm not, this is probably me. The extra step being,
Well, so now if it changed
Right,
as the
so now-
proposed change and you wanted to have a variance, you would have to go to the ZBA.
Right.
Then you'd have to go to the Plan Commission, then you'd have to go to the Village Council.
okay, I understand, thank you.
In terms of schedule, I'd just like to note that that's typically the last month, I think it's the last Wednesday, first Monday of the month. So it's, yes, it's an additional meeting, but the schedule, can all take place fairly quickly.
And it could, and staff gave us an example of that, but it could also not. So, I mean, things don't always proceed directly in time. We know that by experience.
Yes.
I would agree with Bob on this particular item.
All right, stays the same. Commissioner Olson doesn't even have to say anything unless he wants to.
Well, I think it is important for everybody to give their clear direction so we know, but if Commissioner Olson is...
I mean, I think there's clear direction.
Okay.
4 members, I mean, I see both sides.
Yeah, I mean, we're keeping it the way it is.
And both sides are fine, and I'm fine with both of them.
Okay. Thanks.
That was my list, Mayor. I appreciate everybody's indulgence. I'll say it one last time, if I somehow screwed up the process by not understanding where this was supposed to be, I apologize, but I appreciate everybody hopping to it and getting on it tonight.
All right.
Dave and Enzo,
We all want to see it in January, but that's okay. At least you didn't nail these to the door of Village Hall with your 11 points.
do you feel like you got enough clear and appropriate direction to prepare something for next week and have a final vote?
Yes, on both counts. We have clear direction, and yes, we think we can get it packaged up and rewritten for next week. Thank you.
Yeah, that shouldn't be a problem. All right, now, we do have one other item to discuss tonight on our first reading or workshop agenda, and that is item 9D as in David, but that's going to be in the committee room, so we're going to adjourn into the committee room and take up that item, which is discussion of the Ogden Avenue sidewalk. So we'll finish up the remaining items on our agenda here before we do that. So we'll skip then to item 10, which is the mayor's report, and a few things I want to do. First of all, is read a couple of proclamations that I apologize for not reading earlier because there was all kinds of chaos going on. The train was late, platform construction, the crossings weren't working. It was just real
One word.
Anarchy.
One word.
One
Metro.
Metro.
So let's start with a very important week, and I'm sure someone already mentioned this earlier tonight about Police Officer Memorial Day and the Bark Memorial Service that takes place later this week. So I assume someone already mentioned that as a reminder, so I won't do it again. Whereas the Congress and President of the United States have designated May 15 as Peace Officers Memorial Day and the week in which it falls as Police Week. And whereas the members of the Downers Grove Police Department play an essential role in safeguarding the rights and freedoms of Downers Grove. And whereas it is important that all citizens know and understand the problems, duties, and responsibilities of their police department, and that members of the Downers Grove Police Department recognize their duty to serve the people by safeguarding life and property, by protecting them against violence or disorder, and by protecting the innocent against deception and the weak against oppression. And whereas the Downers Grove Police Department unceasingly provides a vital public service, now therefore I, Martin T. Tully, Mayor of the Village of Downers Grove, call upon all citizens of Downers Grove and upon all patriotic, civil, and educational organizations to observe the week of May 11 through 17, 2014 as Police Week, with appropriate ceremonies in which all of our people may join in commemorating police officers past and present, by who their faithful and loyal devotion to their responsibilities have rendered a dedicated service to their communities, and in doing so, have established for themselves an unenviable and enduring reputation for preserving the rights and security of all citizens. And Deputy Chief Bluter, can I present this to you? Would you come on up? We'll make up for the belatedness. You didn't know you got called in. Good to see you. I saw that with the camera, so we had to do this. There's always good. Thank you. He photoshops this, so I can watch that. Yes, very important week, thank you. And of course, at the ceremony, there'll be many more moving words and remembrances stated. So again, echo the words of my colleagues earlier today as a reminder to attend if you can. Next, another essential part of our village, because those police and fire trucks can't get from point A to point B unless they can get through the streets in order to do so. And this past winter, that was more important than anything. But our public works folks do many, many things that are critical to maintaining the day-to-day functionality of our community. So I also have a proclamation for Public Works Week here in Downers Grove. Whereas public works services provided in our community are an integral part of our citizens' everyday lives, and whereas the support of an understanding and informed citizenry is vital to the efficient operation of public works systems and programs such as water, storm sewers, street transportation, and public buildings. Whereas the health, safety, and comfort of this community greatly depends upon these facilities and services. And whereas the efficiency of the qualified and dedicated personnel who staff the Public Works Department is materially influenced by the people's attitude and understanding of the importance of the work that they perform, now, therefore, I, Martin T. Tully, Mayor of the Village of Downers Grove, do hereby proclaim the week of May 18 through 24, 2014 as Public Works Week in Downers Grove, and call upon all citizens and civic organizations to acquaint themselves with the issues involved in providing our public works and to recognize the contribution which public works personnel make every day to our health, safety, comfort, and quality of life. And of course, I have to pick on you, Nan. You have to come up and take this. Sure. Our Public Works Director, Nan Newland. Thank you very much. There's always just a few more things, if you'll bear with me. Number one, I want to remind everyone that we do have coffee with the council this Saturday, beginning at 9 o'clock at the Main Street Station. Of course, the downtown market is up and running. That was great to see last week. It really means that summer might actually be here. That's terrific. So you can come on down, and members of the Village Council and staff will be outside of the train station available to take comments or questions on matters of a general nature. And then as soon as that is over, you'll have just enough time to make it over to the Mokel's Hardware Building dedication. The Downers Grove Historical Society is dedicating that building, which has huge historical significance in Downers Grove, which is, of course, a community that is very rich in heritage. And that will take place on May 17th as well at 10:30 a.m., located at 5122 Main Street. Some really terrific history there. And last, I know that I'm sure that Commissioner Olson already mentioned the Noah's Run for Hope race that starts at O'Neill on May 18th at 8:30. But if you want to warm up for that race, of course, there's a Run for Rwanda race that takes place at McCullum Park the day before.
I mentioned both.
Oh, you did mention both. Rats.
He's way ahead of you.
Right, so, but what I don't know is, can you do the run at McCullum Park and make it over to Coffee with the Council by 9? Sure. You probably could.
The run at McCollum is at 7:30.
Oh, is it at 7:30? I thought it was later.
I could make it to Coffee with the Council at 8.
He'll run the race and have the suit back on and be a Coffee with the Council. No time.
Absolutely.
All right.
I'll be a Coffee with the Council leaving early.
Very well scheduled, like a fine-oiled machine. That's all I have for the mayor's report. That brings us to item 11, which is the mayor's report. Mr. Fieldman?
No report tonight, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 12, the attorney's report.
No report tonight, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Item 13, council member new business. Any items of, not like we just didn't hear about 15 of them in the last couple hours. Any council members have any items of new business they would like to raise with the rest of the council at this point? Hearing none, all right, then I will ask for a motion to adjourn, and as a reminder, we are adjourning into the committee room to take up our discussion of the Ogden Avenue Sidewalks Program.
So moved. Second.
Roll call, please.
Commissioner Newstead?
Aye.
Commissioner Durkin?
Aye.
Commissioner Jose?
Aye.
Commissioner Olson?
Aye.
Commissioner Rankin?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Mayor Tully?
Aye, thank you, and we are adjourned. Good night.
All right, we are re-adjourned back into the committee room to continue our discussion of our item regarding Ogden Avenue Sidewalk Program, which was on our first reading agenda.
This is a priority action item for the village this year, and Nan Newland, our Public Works Director, is going to walk us through a way that we can bring the sidewalk system along Ogden Avenue to 90% compliance in about 3 years for a net cost of the village of just over $500,000. Nan.
Thank you, Dave. I think you can see by this exhibit why it's helpful to have the meeting in this room. I think it really portrays the corridor well. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to try to do this very quickly. Just run through. One is summarize where we are today. That's really what the exhibit, I think, helps portray. And then also lay out a recommended action plan with a cost estimate that you can use for discussion purposes to give us some guidance on moving forward with this. So to start with, Ogden Avenue traverses the entire village from east to west, from Williams to the east to Walnut to the west. It's a 3.5 mile long corridor through the village. It has many mixed uses. It was developed over many years with a variety of right-of-way widths, setbacks, lot sizes, and mixed uses along the entire corridor. It's a principal arterial. It's under the jurisdiction of IDOT, and it carries about 35,000 cars a day. To have sidewalk constructed on both sides of the street would be about 37,500 feet for the entire completion of sidewalk. Today, what's shown in the green is 26,400 feet of sidewalk, and the good news is we have about 70% of the corridor already covered with public sidewalk. And that sidewalk is used. I mean, we see people out there all the time, a lot of people that go to work, have business in one place, walk to a business next door in another place. We see well-worn paths where there aren't sidewalk today, so I think it's important to provide those completions and those linkages to this corridor. In 2005, we received a federal Surface Transportation Program grant to construct, for the construction portion of the remaining sidewalk at that time. And using that money, we proceeded with engineering, and as we proceed with engineering, it became obvious to us the challenge of the property acquisition portion of this project, which is why in 2010, we made the decision to do one phase of this work, and we constructed 3,300 feet of sidewalk where we already had right-of-way in those gaps. That was shortly after I came here to the village. And that is included in what's shown in the green. So what remains today is the yellow portions and the red portions. The yellow we identified as dedication, where dedication of an easement will not interfere substantially with the activity on that property. So we have a couple of examples of these properties here where there's adequate room and a setback from the existing parking where we could put in sidewalk. And when we would go to acquire the easement, we would not be incurring what they would call damage to the remainder. We would not be eliminating parking from their operation or affecting their access. So we would only be, what we would be paying for would just be essentially that portion of property without affecting the way they use their property. This is another example here. These businesses are actually encroaching onto the right-of-way, but there is room here to put the sidewalk in. That accounts for 8,000 feet of the missing sidewalk segments, and that's 21% of the corridor. So if we were able to construct that, we would be up to over 90% of the sidewalk constructed in the corridor. What's shown in the red are properties where us purchasing the right-of-way would materially impact their operation. In this case, this is a used car dealership. The right-of-way extends beyond this area on their property, and their building face, the room they have between their building face and the parking would cut into their ability to store cars and to showcase their cars. So we would be, as we negotiate an easement, we would be affecting their business, and that would affect the price, and we'd be paying more money. In some cases, this is also true here, there's a very narrow strip, and in some cases there's structural issues like power poles or retaining walls or other types of structures that, so it's not only always just taking away property they are using for parking, but in some cases it's also a structural construction issue. Now, these properties we've identified as red. So for these reasons, staff recommends moving forward with acquisition and sidewalk construction of the yellow segments along Ogden Avenue, which, as I said, would bring us up to over 91% of completion of sidewalk. That is 45 parcels that we would be acquiring to proceed with that. Because it is IDOT right-of-way, we would have to follow the IDOT procurement policies to use their federal money. And we've calculated the costs of that. Land acquisition would represent $360,000, and that would include title work, appraisals, negotiations, property closings, and easement costs. It would also include updating the land descriptions that we'd use in the acquisition process. The construction would account for $600,000 of the cost, for a total of $960,000. The grant would reimburse the village for 75% of the construction cost, and that grant could only be used for construction and can only be used for this project. It can't be used for anything else that we would do in any other location or even on this corridor. It's very specific to this project, which would account for $450,000 of the cost, with a net cost of $510,000. We would recommend that the red portions be evaluated and move forward as projects redevelop on Ogden, and we create opportunities with new businesses and new redevelopment to take care of those setback issues or those structural issues when those properties redevelop. So, I missed anything, or are there any questions I can answer?
You said that that's 45 areas in yellow, right?
It's 84 parcels.
It's actually 84 parcels. Just to add one thing, we think this will take about 3 years. We think it's 2 years' worth of work in acquiring rights-of-way using the IDOT-approved process, so it's a labor-intensive process. Some of this cost is reliance on outside consultants, appraisers, outside attorneys, title work, et cetera. Yet there would be a significant amount of work from the legal department, public works department, just managing these consultants. So 2 years' worth of acquisition work, and then 1 year to construct the sidewalks. Now, if we got significant sections of the yellow all in a row early in the process, then we might be able to construct as we go. But generally, about $500,000, about 3 years of the process. And currently, we do not have these funds budgeted, so we would either have to take money from other projects that we would do and pledge it to this, or we would have to come up with new revenues. Happy to answer any further questions.
But that $500,000 would be spread theoretically over the 3 years in some proportion, depending on
Actually,
what...
because of the way the grant works,
Right, so that would be
incur all of the land acquisition.
Probably year one. Gotcha.
By 2 years.
In that, we can only use the money for physical construction, so the grant would come in later.
Gotcha.
Is time of the essence here? Are we concerned that the state's going to pull the grant?
We have just asked for a 2-year extension to the grant. So we've been getting extensions as we go. It's not guaranteed, but they have been extending it.
However, we've had this grant on the books for somewhere between 8 to 10 years. In that sense, I think we need to use it or lose it at this point.
Do you feel like some of the red sections do have, like the Soccer 2000 photo, there is within the right-of-way, say an asphalt or even a concrete pad like we have here at the car dealer. So while it may be the more difficult sites to get the right-of-way acquisition, there is technically a walkable area that's not grass or pavement. That seems from the dots and where they, the red marks are, it seems like those lots would have some sort of improved parking lot in that area.
Some do and some are grass.
Some are grass still.
It's a variety.
Yeah, I have to keep an eye out when I drive up and down.
So,
Keep riding the road.
one of the,
Two eyes.
when we discussed this with staff individually, one of the things that this lent, when I looked at this map, that I saw is the opportunity to divide this corridor into 4 discrete segments. First segment being from Limit to Belmont, then Belmont to Main Street to Fairview, and Fairview to the village limit. And being Belmont, Main, and Fairview being the stoplights where people can easily, or more easily, cross Ogden Avenue. And it seems to me that it may be desirable to have a contiguous stretch of sidewalk on one side between those segments. And in looking at it, if you see Belmont, right, village limit to Belmont is green or yellow on the south side. Belmont to Main Street is green or yellow on the south side. Fairview to this village limit is green or yellow on the south side. Main to Fairview is a challenge, but it is green or yellow except for this parcel on the north side. So one of the things that I had suggested is, from a staff perspective, and I'd like to suggest to the council is, I agree with staff's recommendation on the yellow, but what perhaps if we were to go through with that type of an approach where there's contiguous sidewalk on one side between those major areas, if that's something that would be possible and what type of cost.
So that would
might
go
be incurred.
south, north, south, south.
Correct.
Yeah, and if you look at that, there's only a couple segments of yellow that we would not be constructing, so the cost estimates would not be substantially different. There's a section here and a section here. So there'd be some savings in the approach. It would reduce the number of parcels we're working with.
Looks like another section down here too, on the north side of Ogden.
Right. And but there is that one red section if you were to do that approach, which would increase cost.
Right, and that's why we actually picked this photo. You can see the situation we'd be dealing with here. This appears to be a situation where the property line actually extends out of what people think is the right-of-way line. Because of the history of Ogden Avenue, the right-of-way line is not in line. It jogs in and out, and it looks to us like this is private property, at least up to this curb line. So this would narrow the amount of red that we'd be working on. Looks like just to a parcel or two then.
To piggyback off of Jeff's question though, that looks somewhat safely walkable. I mean, it's not ideal, obviously, but I think to the extent we got stuck with that one small portion of red, it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the world.
Is there any area on Ogden and there's red that is not passable? I mean, is it like you can't walk there anyhow? You'd have to walk into Ogden Avenue to get by if you're north or south of the street?
I think from an accessibility definition, none of these red areas are truly walkable. Some of them present more challenges than others. Certainly there are sections that include just dirt with curbs that come up, that protrude out of the dirt over by the burrito place, in the middle section of the strip.
And it's going to depend on what's going on at
Right
any
here.
point in time.
And also, there tend to be cars parked that would impede pedestrian activities and movement. So it can, there are sections that can be very challenging for pedestrians.
Does any of this proposed construction, this is all where there's no sidewalk? None of this considers making real sidewalks? Right? And so we're going to, I struggle with this because a huge portion of these sidewalks are arguably not real sidewalks. They're on the curb. And when they're on the curb, there's concrete there. But there's also snow there, there's also water there, there's also 45 mile an hour, 30,000 cars a day there. They're kind of arguably sidewalks. So none of this anticipates changing any of that, right? This just talks about whether there's actually no sidewalk.
Correct.
Are we considering in any of these cases, any sort of more aggressive land acquisition, whether they be eminent domain, condemnation, trying to get to the point where, if you were sketching this and you were developing Ogden Avenue today, you'd have situations like, I guess, leading up to that one red spot where you had 6, 8, 10 feet of green space and then you had a sidewalk. So are we going to put it where we can easily get it and then be putting new sidewalks on the curb? Or is this all going to be set back with green space?
We will place the sidewalk as far back as we can. The challenge is that there's a lot of properties that don't have as much setback as...
How do we define can?
Based on what they'll sell us, without condemnation
So
first.
That's
Like in this case, based on how far we can move it back without impacting their parking or their existing operation.
That's why I'm asking the question, because I have very little interest in adding more on-curb sidewalk, whether it's paid for by somebody else or not, because I think it's kind of allows us to say we've put a sidewalk in, but it's not really what we're intending in terms of the purpose of the sidewalks is enhanced, consistent pedestrian traversing of our community. So I don't like that. I don't like the idea of spending any money to put a sidewalk on a curb.
Even if it improves the walkway as it currently sits?
Yeah, I'd rather...
So with that Jeepers, you'd rather have somebody wander right through the dandelions and the grass and wander over to crack asphalt than have what would be a safer walking path than what's being exposed or being shared with us in that photograph?
I'd rather us incur additional cost and more aggressively pursue the property we need to put in an appropriate sidewalk.
I think the legal costs of that are prohibitive.
Yeah,
I think you're talking about condemning.
car there.
Right, you're talking about incurring an awful lot of costs to go through the condemnation proceedings, which they would force you to do, and then to pay the property owner for the damage to the remainder because you've eliminated their ability to park there.
That's right.
I think we're talking millions upon millions of dollars that I know I'm not willing to spend.
Yeah.
From a practical standpoint, what would probably happen there is the offer eventually would be to buy the whole property. And then if you were to construct the sidewalk back 10, 12, 15 feet away from the curb line, the effective depth of the property we would own that would be available for resale for redevelopment purposes would have very little value unless we were to also buy or facilitate purchase of the residential properties behind it.
I think the staff proposal of trying to go with the yellow phase first, I think David's idea is intriguing of maybe doing one side or the other, but if we have all the outside contractors and consultants on retainer, I'd say just go for it all. Obviously, we need to come up with a way to budget and find dollars for it, but since our item that we talked about tonight for sidewalk is the balance of the sidewalk matrix, but for those two sections, that's $571,000 right there. So, I mean, there is potential for budgeting to find the dollars for something like this going out over 3 years. So I think the connectivity is a important aspect, but seeing people on Ogden Avenue and how they get around, it is the same people, but it is also folks that may be coming from the high schools, it might be coming from a park, and allowing them to have a way to walk to Omega on a designated sidewalk, whether it's rightfully so too close to the roadway or not, it still is a designated path, and it's a safer flat area to walk. There'll be the accessible ramps and, curb areas at the appropriate spots. So I think Dave's comment about are these passable, I think the term accessible is the better term than actually walkable. You can walk through the Lee and Ogden area. If you're going to be following a coyote through there, it's a coyote path. You can walk across the way there between D&M Corvette and Pugie Mazda, but it's up a hill next to a retaining wall on the side of a hill. If you improve that with a real sidewalk, sure, there'll still be a grade, but you'll be on the concrete. It may be closer than the street that we desire, but I don't think I'm interested in purchasing a whole property to just get a parcel, the frontage of sidewalk. I'd rather shoot for the right-of-way, see where the right-of-ways are. I'm sure our staff will use the design elements that they see fit to make it safe and get the right size sidewalk in the right area.
Would it make sense off of going, kind of following David's line of thought to just eliminate some of this? To follow up, David's got this point of one sort of continuous path east to west, which makes a lot of sense as a goal. And at the same time, when I hear, what are you doing walking from D&M to Pugie? Find someplace else. So are you walking from your Corvette to buy into Pugie?
Sure. Or you're walking from Pugie
so you
to
can walk down Carr Road to buy a car? Come on.
Maybe you're going to the old McDonald's, or maybe you're going to Wanamaker's from D&M because your car's getting worked on.
Or you're going to the Aston Martin dealer to
maybe you're going from Soccer 2000 to Panera. Who knows?
It's a $500,000 of money we don't have budgeted, and it's 3 years worth of staff time. I'm just thinking I'd love to find a way to minimize it. I hear that clearly everybody wants to put a sidewalk on Ogden Avenue. I don't, but if we're going to do it, let's just not do it to do it. Let's figure out how to minimize the scope of the whole thing so we pare down on the costs and resources that we take.
I apologize, somebody already pointed this out. Of the yellow sections, how many of them, or how much of them, I should say, fall into the category that Bob has an issue with, where it would be right up against the curb?
We can
I'm sure I don't expect you to point that out right here, but.
And a lot of it depends on what somebody would be willing to sell us.
No, I mean places where we could put it in right now, but in order to do so without acquiring any additional, or without, by the nature of where it would go.
I think we can tell that from the plans that we have.
Yeah, I gotta imagine you have some idea of which ones are most likely to be right up against the street.
We can let you know that.
Because the question I have is whether that map, it just happens, wouldn't that be nice? It just happens to comport with what Commissioner Olson's talking about. That might actually be an interesting data point.
The other concept here is this is a little bit more art than
You
science
might
in
need
some
orange.
respect. Orange, we talked about that. We had a version with 5 colors.
Oh,
There are some redevelopment activities occurring that allow us to put these sidewalks in.
Yeah, of course.
And so like this right here, which we just approved tonight.
Right.
That now will be proper setback, properly designed through redevelopment.
Yeah, and it is possible that over 3 years, other things will happen.
Yes.
And to the extent we're looking for head nods, I agree that to the extent we can, we should minimize cost and impact the one side idea that Commissioner Olson floated. And I also like Commissioner Newstadt's idea of once we complete the matrix, what do we do with, we've got whatever the $570,000, are we going to repurpose that? And I think this would be one good way to repurpose that.
And so there's 2 priority action item policy discussions that relate to each other. This is one of them. The other one later in this year and the next year is what are we going to do with our new residential sidewalk construction program and policy? Are we going to finish up the matrix and move into the special area subdivisions, or are we going to go back and construct sidewalks in areas of high pedestrian traffic, or are we not going to be in the business of constructing new sidewalks, just maintaining what we have? The policy issue that's here today is really a direction to staff. Should Enza and Nan and their teams start to prepare for consideration of the council the professional contracts that are required to start to move forward on this? When we have some that would be ready to go this year, most of them have budgetary impacts, or we would budget for them in the 2015 budget, and then bring those agenda items forward, starting at the end of 2014, once the 2015 budget is approved. So the real question is, would you like us to start bringing forth the budget aspects of this and the professional services contracts?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
No. I don't. Well, just for the record, though, let's not get ahead of ourselves and assume that ending the sidewalk matrix, but for Johnson Woods and Denver Woods, all of a sudden frees up some chunk of money. It's money we don't have, for starters, and we don't have a settled policy on the balance of the village relative to sidewalks.
I agree with that. Thinking a little further down the road, what I would be envisioning, were I the only one making the decision, is sort of a one-year hiatus in residential building in order to accomplish this, and then move back to whatever else we might want to accomplish.
It's a possible outcome, but we haven't had the conversation about residential sidewalks.
Right. And the good news is we go from sort of policy level discussion down to budgeting. This, head nods tonight would just tell staff to start putting this in for consideration this fall with budgeting. And then you'd start to see trade-offs and actual dollar amounts and how many years we would apportion this over multiple budgets and get in the nitty-gritty then. The real question is, should we start that conversation or not even have it?
Start the conversation.
I support this, for the record. That went down in flames.
That's why we have meetings with odd numbers of people.
Let's pause for a moment and questions from the audience. Marge?
Yeah, we've got money in the TIF funds, the Ogden Avenue TIF, could that money be used for this?
Yes. That would be part of the budgetary discussion. Not all of Ogden is in the TIF. The TIF stretches from
Use that money for
about Florence to about
Florence,
Stonewall.
yeah.
Use it.
But there's not that much in, one bad property between Florence and, so it's not too bad.
But that would be part of the budgetary discussion.
Good point.
I know this isn't to improve retirement necessarily, but yeah, it's great that we have sidewalks on, well, ultimately both sides. Because if you put it at one, where are you going to cross? You've only got so many lights.
The stoplights.
You want to cross in the middle of it. Nobody wants high school kids to cross when they have lights. But that's one thing. The other thing is at least 3 months out of the year, nobody's going to be able to use them. Because if IDOT's going to come and plow that, it's going to be dumped onto the sidewalk. Now, who's going to take it off the sidewalk? You going to put that onus on the property owner? Don't put it away.
That's exactly what'll happen. It happens every winter. That's exactly what'll happen. It happens every winter. We go and remind everybody, you gotta clear your sidewalk.
I hear the same thing from residential property owners.
Right. It's a problem everywhere, I think.
Yeah. Or we can be like Darien and have a sidewalk
We have one
snow
thing-
removal crew, which
We have one thing
started
in our
by
book that says you
Carmen
gotta
Soldado,
plow at least once a year.
still in
It's
existence.
not enough for something, never for a US highway. What have other towns done, you know? Like
What, plowing snow off the sidewalk?
sidewalks on one side of the road.
Ogden stretches through multiple jurisdictions, and some of them look a lot like ours, where there's some sidewalk and some not. Others have undertaken programs to put most of it in, and it varies from Chicago all the way out to, where is it, in Aurora, somewhere around there.
Well, Tom, just in response to what Tom had said is, the reason that I suggested the contiguous stretches as it is, that the crossings would be at the the stoplights and, that the contiguous stretches. So you could cross conceivably at
You weren't
those.
doing it randomly.
Right. It wasn't those random, it wasn't that pick random streets, it was the 3 stoplights that currently exist on Ogden, major streets.
Joe?
I agree with some of these comments. It is a 3-season sidewalk. Nobody, well, a few people shovel along Ogden. But like taking Soccer 2000, like when you're walking, you kind of, if there's a sidewalk and then you go through the Soccer 2000 parking lot, and you know, and then if the snow's not too deep, you go through, people go in and out when they're walking along Ogden. And even Commissioner Olson's idea of, okay, people can cross over on Main and then go to Fairview and cross back, people won't do that. People stay on one side and then they'll like go up the hill and through the parking lot till they find the next section of sidewalk. And then then there's so many people that just kind of run to that center turn lane and wait till the traffic, you know, if there's an opening to the left, they run and then they wait in the center till there's an opening on the right and then they, you know, people won't go to the light. The regulars, regular crossers of Ogden.
I mean, this, you know, I think fundamentally, I'm not wedded to the idea. I think the idea of improving the sidewalks along Ogden Avenue is something, you know, we're taking 70%. We have 70% coverage, moving it to 91%. And so it's going to help everyone. You know, is it going to be perfect? No. But this is going to make a lot better. Make a lot better. A lot better. Make a big difference.
Can I ask, is this construction grant tied specifically to Ogden Avenue?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so it can't be used for sidewalk anyplace else?
This is a question about financing. Because you, like I said in the room here, you expect, where we were talking about facilities, and regardless of which option you chose, we still come up $10 million short. And over the time frame, I would think doing this over 2-3 years would push that back. And what's that going to cost us in upkeep for this building? When's the state going to come to the police department and say, you got to have more facilities because we require X, Y, and Z?
Lots to look at. That's why they pay us the big bucks.
Long-range planning meeting's coming up, Tom. It's like you're previewing some of the chapters.
Right, exactly. More to come. Well, thank you for those comments. Anything else? Appreciate it. Any other thoughts, comments, questions from the council? I think the direction was pretty clear.
Go to the next.
There's even a sound effect that went along with it.